Good morning, Admiral. The words landed in the middle of my wedding reception like a stone dropped into still water. Conversation stopped. Forks hovered mid-air. Chairs scraped as people turned. I remember the sound of fabric shifting, dozens of guests twisting in their seats at once, trying to understand who the man in the tailored navy suit was speaking to. He was standing straight, shoulders squared, eyes fixed on me. And then he saluted. For a moment no one moved, not even me. Across the room I saw Harold, my soon-to-be father-in-law, go pale. His confident smile collapsed, his jaw loosening as if someone had cut the strings holding it in place. But that moment didn't begin there. It began long before the wedding, long before Harold's words cut through me in front of everyone I had come to call family. It began with a choice I made years ago to live quietly. I've never been the kind of woman who needed attention. After I retired, I moved to a small coastal town in Virginia just outside Norfolk. It was the kind of place where mornings started with the sound of gulls and ended with neighbors waving from their porches. Nothing fancy, just steady, familiar, and honest. I liked it that way. My house was modest, white siding, a narrow front porch, and a garden I tended myself. I grew tomatoes in the summer-trimmed hedges in the fall, and kept a small American flag by the door, not out of habit but out of respect. Most people in town knew me simply as Evelyn. Not ma'am, not commander, not admiral. Just Evelyn. And that was exactly how I wanted it. I met Richard at a community fundraiser. It was one of those local events where everyone brings a dish and someone inevitably burns the casserole. I had made lemon bars. He had brought store-bought cookies and apologized for them before anyone even tasted one. He was kind in a way that felt rare these days. Not loud, not showy, just present. We talked for nearly an hour that night. About books, about the ocean, about how strange it felt to start over later in life. He told me he'd been widowed for 5 years. I told him I understood loss. Neither of us asked too many questions. That was the beginning. Richard never pressed me about my past. He knew I had worked in government, and that seemed to satisfy him. Maybe it was his generation he understood that some things didn't need to be said out loud. Or maybe he trusted me enough not to ask. Either way, I was grateful. Because the truth was, I didn't want to be known for what I had been. I wanted to be known for who I was. Richard's family, on the other hand, was different. They were respectable people, established, the kind who took pride in their name and made sure others knew it. His father, Harold, had spent decades working in federal contracting. He carried himself like a man who had earned every ounce of his success and expected acknowledgement for it. The first time I met him, he shook my hand firmly and looked me up and down in a way that felt more like an evaluation than a greeting. So he said, "Richard tells me you've had a quiet career." I smiled politely. I suppose you could say that. He nodded, but there was something behind his eyes. Curiosity maybe, or doubt. I had seen that look before. Over the next few months, as Richard and I grew closer, Harold's tone didn't change. He wasn't openly rude, not at first. But there were comments. Small ones, careful ones. The kind that could be brushed off if you didn't want to make a scene. I imagine retirement must be easier when expectations weren't too high to begin with. You've done well for yourself, considering. Richard's always had a generous heart. I learned to let them pass. At my age, you learn which battles are worth fighting, and which ones aren't. Richard didn't see it. Or maybe he saw pieces of it but didn't understand the full picture. He loved his father, respected him. And Harold wasn't used to being challenged. So I chose peace. When Richard proposed, it was simple. We were sitting on my porch watching the sun settle into the water. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a small box, and said, "I don't want to spend whatever time I have left without you." There was no grand speech, no audience, just honesty. I said yes. Planning the wedding brought the families together more often. That's when the tension became harder to ignore. Harold began asking more direct questions. What exactly did you do in government? Was it administrative work policy? And your pension, is it sufficient? I answered carefully, always respectfully. I worked in operations. It was a long career. I'm comfortable. But it wasn't enough for him. He wanted specifics. He wanted something he could measure. Something he could place on his internal scale of worth. One afternoon during a planning lunch, he leaned back in his chair and said, You know, Evelyn, a marriage isn't just about companionship. It's about standing, about reputation. I met his gaze calmly. I agree. He nodded satisfied for a moment, then added, I just want to be sure my son isn't settling. The table went quiet. Richard shifted in his seat. Dad. But I placed my hand gently over Richard's. It's all right, I said softly. And it was. Not because his words didn't matter, but because I had spent a lifetime learning that people often reveal more about themselves than they intend. Still, I could feel it building. The unspoken judgment. The assumptions. The quiet dismissal. And I knew sooner or later it would surface. Not in private, but where it would matter most. Looking back now, I realize I had a choice. I could have told them everything. Laid it all out. My career, my rank, my history. I could have ended the questions before they even began. But that wouldn't have changed who they were. And it wouldn't have shown me who they truly were either. So I stayed silent. And I waited. Because respect that depends on titles isn't respect at all. And on the day of my wedding, I would finally see just how far that truth would go. By the week of the wedding, I had learned something I think most people discover eventually. If they live long enough, not every family greets change with warmth, even when they call it happiness. Richard and I were getting married on a Saturday in late May in a small Episcopal church near the waterfront. Nothing extravagant. Fresh flowers, a reception at the local yacht club, and a guest list mostly made up of family old friends and people from the community who had known one or both of us for years. It was the sort of wedding people our age appreciate, elegant, without fuss, warm, without spectacle. That was what I wanted. At my age, a wedding isn't about proving anything. It isn't about a grand entrance or a dramatic display. It's about making a promise with clear eyes and a grateful heart. Richard understood that. He wanted the same thing I did, a peaceful day, a meaningful ceremony, and the comfort of beginning a new chapter without pretending we were 25. But peace, I was beginning to understand, was not something Harold intended to offer me. The trouble with men like him is not that they're loud. Loud men can be dealt with. You know where they stand. You hear them coming. The difficult ones are the polished men, the respectable men, the ones who smile while they diminish you, and then act surprised when you notice. Harold had perfected that style over a lifetime. 3 days before the wedding, Richard and I drove to his parents' house for a small family dinner. His mother, Diane, had made pot roast and green beans, and the dining room looked exactly as it always had. China cabinet, polished table runner, pressed silverware laid out with the care of people raised to believe that proper manners could hold a family together. Diane herself was gentle but quiet in the way some women become after decades of accommodating a stronger personality. She was never unkind to me. In fact, I think she liked me. But liking someone and standing up for them are not always the same thing. Richard's younger sister, Marianne, was there too, along with her husband, Kent. Marianne was pleasant enough, though she carried a kind of social alertness that made her seem always to be measuring the room. Kent was one of those men who spoke very little until he had something sharp to say. Dinner started smoothly. Diane asked about the flowers. Marianne wanted to know whether I had chosen ivory or white for my dress. Richard talked about the seating chart. For nearly 20 minutes the meal felt normal. Then Harold set down his water glass and turned to me. So, Evelyn, he said with that polished tone of his I've been meaning to ask, what was your title exactly? The table quieted. I cut a small piece of roast and answered the same way I had before. I worked in naval operations. That's not really a title, he said. No, I replied calmly, it's not. He gave a short laugh as if I had confirmed something for him. Well, I suppose some jobs are harder to explain than others. Richard looked up. Dad. What Harold said, lifting his hand slightly, I'm making conversation. But he wasn't. We all knew that. I sipped my iced tea and let the moment pass. That was one of the habits service had taught me better than anything else. Silence can be its own form of control. You do not answer every provocation. You do not rise to every baited line. Sometimes you let a person keep talking until they show everyone at the table exactly who they are. Harold turned to Richard. I'm just surprised, that's all. A man ought to know the details before marriage. Richard's face tightened. I know enough. Harold looked at him for a long second. Do you? Diane immediately reached for the breadbasket as if dinner could be rescued by carbohydrates. Who wants another roll? No one answered. I set down my fork and met Harold's eyes. Richard knows what matters. His expression sharpened just slightly. That depends on your definition of matters. There it was again. Not quite an insult. Not quite a question. Just enough poison to settle into the conversation without making a stain anyone else felt obligated to clean up. Marianne cleared her throat. Dad, really? But Harold was in no mood to retreat. I'm only saying, he continued, that marriage is serious, at our age especially. Finances, background stability, these aren't things you gloss over. Richard pushed back from the table a little. We haven't glossed over anything. Harold gave a thin smile. You say that now? I could feel the heat of everyone's discomfort spreading through the room, but inside myself I stayed cool. That had always been my refuge. Calm is not the absence of feeling. It is the decision not to let feeling drive the ship. I've done very well taking care of myself, I said. Harold nodded slowly. I'm sure you believe that. The words hung there. Marianne stared at her plate. Kent reached for his drink and said nothing. Diane looked stricken. Richard was halfway between anger and embarrassment, which is an unhappy place for a grown son to be. And in that moment I understood something important. Harold did not simply disapprove of me. He resented the fact that I would not present myself for inspection. Men like him are comfortable with resumes. They understand pedigree, salary, job titles, family background. Those things help them sort people into categories that make them feel secure. But a woman who remains self-contained, who answers politely without volunteering more than she chooses, unsettles them. She cannot be ranked so easily. That was what bothered him. Not my past. My refusal to place it in his hands. After dinner, while Diane and Marianne cleared the table, I stepped out onto the back patio for air. The evening was mild, the sky washed in that soft, golden light you get just before sunset. Their yard backed up to a stretch of trees, and for a moment all I could hear were birds and the distant hum of traffic. Richard came out a minute later and closed the screen door behind him. I'm sorry, he said. I leaned against the railing. You don't need to apologize for your father's manners. Yes, I do. He rubbed the back of his neck. He's been worse than usual. I looked at him. Has he? Richard let out a tired breath and gave me a sheepish look. No, probably not. I just kept hoping he'd settle down. I smiled, though there was sadness in it. People don't usually become kinder because there's a wedding. He looked away, then back at me. You could tell me, you know. Tell you what? Whatever it is you're not saying. His voice was gentle, not accusing. I've never pushed because I didn't want to pry, but sometimes I feel like there's this whole part of your life standing quietly behind you, and I'm the only one in the room who can't see it. That touched me more deeply than Harold's barbs ever could. I folded my hands in front of me. Richard, there are parts of my life I don't talk about because I spent years living in places where talking too much wasn't wise, and after a while privacy becomes less of a habit and more of a comfort. I know, he said, but I'm not your commanding officer. I'm the man marrying you. There was pain in his voice, and that pained me. So I stepped closer and rested my hand on his arm. And I love you for your heart, not your questions. He covered my hand with his. That's not an answer. No, I said softly, it isn't. We stood there together for a few seconds in the fading light. Then I said the only thing I could say honestly. There are things I will tell you, but I want to do it in my own time. Richard studied my face, then nodded. All right. It was one of the reasons I loved him. He knew how to leave a door open without forcing it wider. Inside, I could hear Diane calling that dessert was ready. We went back in together. Harold was sitting at the head of the table as if nothing had happened, which was his specialty. Men who wound people often prefer to act as though the wound is imaginary. The next day brought more of the same. At the final meeting with the reception coordinator, Harold questioned the guest list, the seating chart, even the choice of music. Every objection of his somehow circled back to me. Do you know these people well enough to invite them? Are you sure your side isn't a little sparse? I suppose second marriages are always harder to organize. He never raised his voice. He didn't need to. His contempt was refined, polished smooth by decades of practice. And still I held my tongue. Not because I was weak, not because I was afraid, but because age teaches you that timing matters. There is a difference between defending yourself and revealing someone else. One is impulse, the other is truth. By Friday night, the evening before the wedding, I was alone in my guest room at Richard's house, laying out the blue silk dress I would wear to the rehearsal dinner. My garment bag for the wedding hung nearby. On the dresser sat a small jewelry box, and inside it, wrapped in tissue, was an item I had not worn in years. I opened the box and looked at it for a long moment. Then I closed it again. Not yet. Outside the room, I could hear low voices: Richard on the phone, Diane moving dishes in the kitchen, Harold talking somewhere down the hall. The house was full of that tense, overmanaged quiet families create when they are trying to force harmony before a major event. I sat down on the edge of the bed and smoothed the dress over my knees. I had spent a lifetime in rooms where pressure could turn a situation dangerous in seconds. Compared to that, a difficult family wedding should have been simple. And yet I felt it deep in my bones. Something was coming. Harold wasn't finished. He had been building toward something all week, testing boundaries, probing for weakness, trying to place me beneath him in whatever invisible hierarchy he carried around in his mind. And tomorrow, with a room full of witnesses and nowhere left for courtesy to hide, I suspected he would finally say exactly what he thought of me. I also suspected he would regret it. I woke before dawn on my wedding day, the way I used to wake before inspections, before briefings, before flights out over uncertain water. Old habits remain in the body long after the uniform is folded away. For a few quiet minutes I lay still and listened to the house settle around me. Pipes clicked faintly in the walls. Somewhere downstairs a floorboard creaked. Outside a gull cried over the water. Virginia mornings near the coast have a softness to them in late May, a gray-blue light that makes everything feel held in suspension, as if the day has not yet decided what it means to become. I remember thinking before my feet even touched the floor that this would be one of those days a person carries forever. Not because of the flowers or photographs, and not because of the cake or music. Those things matter in the moment, but they fade. What lasts is how people reveal themselves when emotion rises and the room is watching. By 8 o'clock, the house was gently alive. Diane moved through the kitchen in her robe, making coffee for everyone and pretending she wasn't nervous. Marianne arrived with garment bags, hairpins, and a voice an octave too bright. Richard had left early for the church with Kent, and I was grateful for that. I needed the morning to gather myself. My dress was simple and elegant ivory silk with long sleeves and a modest neckline. At our age, there is a dignity in not trying to reclaim youth. I didn't want to look young. I wanted to look like myself at peace. As Marianne zipped the back for me, she caught my eyes in the mirror. "You look beautiful," she said. "Thank you." She hesitated, then added quietly, "I'm sorry about Dad." I turned slightly. "That's kind of you." Her face tightened. "He gets fixed on things." "Yes," I said, "I've noticed." She gave a small, embarrassed laugh. "Once he decides he understands a person, he doesn't really leave room to be wrong." That was one of the truest things anyone in that family had said. I studied her reflection for a moment and saw not just discomfort but fatigue. Children of strong fathers often spend years learning how to manage a weather system they did not create. "You don't have to carry responsibility for him," I told her. She lowered her eyes. "Maybe not, but somehow we all do." That stayed with me. The ceremony itself was lovely. The church was small, white, and full of warm morning light. Friends from town filled the pews. Richard stood at the front, looking handsome and a little overwhelmed, his gray suit pressed perfectly, his hands clasped too tightly. When he saw me step into the aisle, his whole face changed. Not dramatically, just softly. His shoulders eased. His mouth trembled into a smile that held gratitude and disbelief all at once. That expression alone would have been enough to carry me through the day. The minister spoke simply without flourish. Richard's voice caught when he said his vows. Mine remained steady, though I felt more than I showed. I had stood in rooms with secretaries, senators, foreign officers, and battle groups hanging on my words. Yet nothing in my professional life had ever felt as intimate as promising one man before God and family that I would walk beside him for whatever years remained to us. When the minister pronounced us husband and wife, the church rose in applause. Richard kissed me gently. For a few precious moments, everything Harold had said and implied over the past months faded into the background. The only thing that felt real was the ring on my hand and the warmth of Richard's palm against mine. I wish that had lasted. The reception was held at a yacht club overlooking the water. It wasn't as grand as the name suggests. More old local prestige than modern luxury. Polished wood floors, white tablecloths, brass fixtures framed regatta photographs on the walls. The kind of place where retirees hold anniversary parties and civic boards gather for fundraisers. Comfortable, tasteful, familiar. By early afternoon, the room was full of laughter, clinking glasses, and the easy hum of conversation. The food was good. A trio played standards in the corner. People came up to our table with stories, blessings, warm handshakes. For a while, I let myself believe Harold might preserve the day after all. He moved through the room with his usual confidence, greeting old contacts, shaking hands, patting backs. To anyone who didn't know him well, he looked like a proud father hosting a family celebration. That was part of what made men like Harold difficult. They often save their sharpest edges for private moments, or for moments when social pressure protects them. I noticed he'd had more than one drink, though not enough to slur, just enough to loosen whatever restraint he usually wore. When it came time for speeches, Richard stood first. He thanked everyone for coming, thanked Diane for helping with the arrangements, thanked Marianne for stepping in wherever needed. Then he turned to me. His words were brief and heartfelt. He said that meeting me had made the second half of his life feel unexpectedly full. He said I brought steadiness to his days and joy to his home. He said love at our age wasn't smaller than young love, it was deeper because it arrived carrying memory loss and choice. There wasn't a dry eye at our table. I squeezed his hand when he sat down. Then Harold rose. He lifted his glass and smiled, waiting for the room to settle. His posture was relaxed, practiced. He had likely imagined himself at the center of this moment for weeks. Well, he began, "This is certainly a memorable day." There were a few polite chuckles. "I've watched my son walk through some hard years," he continued. "Losing a wife changes a man. It leaves him vulnerable in ways he may not even recognize." I felt Richard shift beside me. Harold went on. "So when a new person comes along later in life, naturally a father asks questions." The smile on his face remained, but his eyes had sharpened. A few guests looked between us, sensing some current under the words. "And I'll admit he said I had my concerns." Richard set down his fork. "Dad." Harold waved a hand lightly, still smiling. No, hear me out. I'm speaking honestly. That's what families should do." A murmur passed through the room. Diane stared at the tablecloth. Harold turned slightly enough to include me without fully facing me. "You see, Evelyn has always been something of a mystery to us." I sat very still. "She's private," he said. "Very private," which in itself is fine. But when a woman enters a family and keeps so much hidden, people naturally wonder what exactly is being hidden. The room had gone almost silent now. Somewhere near the back, a glass was set down too hard. Richard stood halfway. "That's enough." But Harold continued, his voice a little stronger now, a little less polished. "My son is a decent man. A trusting man. Maybe too trusting. And I'll say what others may have been too polite to say when someone appears out of nowhere with vague stories about government work and a quiet life. A man is entitled to ask whether she's there for love or for security." The words hit the room like a slap. I heard Marianne suck in a breath. Diane looked as if she might cry. Several guests turned toward me immediately, not with suspicion, but with the helpless attention people give a person who has just been publicly struck. Richard pushed back his chair and stood. "You need to stop. Right now." Harold flushed with the terrible courage of a man who mistakes an audience for agreement, pressed on. "I'm only protecting my son. If that embarrasses anyone, so be it." Then he looked directly at me. "For all we know, he said you spent your career pushing papers in some office and learned just enough to make yourself sound important. But this family doesn't owe respect based on vague hints and polished manners." The silence that followed was unlike ordinary silence. It had weight, shame, shock, the sound of 100 people realizing together that something had gone too far. Richard turned to me horrified. "Evelyn." But I placed my hand gently over his wrist. "It's all right," I said. And strangely it was, because humiliation only works when you accept the measure being used against you. Harold thought he was stripping something away from me, but he could only strip away the illusion he had built for others. He had no access to what I actually was. I rose slowly from my seat. Not angrily, not dramatically. Just calmly. Every eye in the room followed me. Harold's face was flushed, but I could see the first hint of uncertainty flicker there. Bullies count on immediate collapse, not composure. They know what to do with tears. They know what to do with shouting. Calm confuses them. I looked at him and said in an even voice, "You are entitled to your opinions, Harold, but you are not entitled to invent my life simply because I declined to perform it for your approval." A few people lowered their eyes. A few others nodded almost imperceptibly. Harold gave a brittle laugh. "Then perhaps you'd like to enlighten us." There it was, the invitation, public, smug, and poisoned. I could have answered then. I could have ended everything with one sentence. Instead, I said no, I don't think I need to. That unsettled him more than anger would have. He opened his mouth again, perhaps to say something even crueler when the doors at the back of the reception room opened. At first, no one paid much attention. Just another late guest, perhaps. But then the room's focus shifted in a way I recognized instantly. Heads turned not from curiosity, but from the subtle force of authority entering a space. A tall man in a dark suit stepped inside, silver-haired, straight-backed, carrying himself with unmistakable military bearing. Two others followed behind him, though they remained a respectful distance back. Harold's expression changed. Only slightly, but enough. He knew him. And as the man moved through the parted crowd, his gaze fixed not on Harold, not on Richard, but on me, I realized that the day Harold had worked so hard to control had finally slipped beyond his reach. The room seemed to hold its breath as the man approached. I recognized him immediately, though it had been years since we had last stood in the same room. Time had etched deeper lines into his face, and his hair had gone fully silver, but his posture hadn't changed. It never would. Men like him don't forget who they are even when the uniform comes off. Rear Admiral Thomas Whitaker. Harold's superior. And once long ago, mine in a different chain of command. He walked past tables of guests who instinctively moved aside, though most of them didn't understand why. There's a certain presence that doesn't need explanation. It's felt not announced. When he reached me, he stopped. Straightened. And then, in one smooth, unmistakable motion, he raised his hand in a formal salute. "Good morning, Admiral." You could have heard a pin drop. The words didn't echo, but they carried, across every table, through every whispered assumption, into every corner of that room where people had just watched me be measured and dismissed. For a moment I didn't move. Not because I didn't know what to do, but because I understood exactly what this moment meant. Then quietly I returned the salute. "Good morning, Tom," I said. Not loudly, not for effect. Just enough. A ripple passed through the room, sharp inhales, chairs, shifting the soft clatter of someone setting down a glass too quickly. I turned slightly and looked at Harold. His face had drained of color completely now. The confidence, the authority he had worn like a well-tailored jacket all afternoon, it was gone. In its place was something far more honest. Shock. And beneath it, fear. His mouth opened, then closed. No words came out. That more than anything told me he understood. Whitaker lowered his hand and gave me a small, respectful nod. Then, as if remembering where he was, he glanced around the room. "I apologize for arriving unannounced," he said, addressing no one in particular. "I was informed of the event late, but I felt it would be appropriate to attend." His eyes flickered briefly toward Harold. There was no hostility there. Just clarity. Harold swallowed hard. "Admiral, I didn't realize." Whitaker's expression didn't change. "No," he said calmly. "You didn't." That was all. No reprimand, no raised voice. But it landed heavier than anything Harold had said all day. I could feel every eye on me now. Not curious anymore. Not skeptical. Something else. Recognition, perhaps? Or the uneasy awareness that they had just witnessed something shift in a way they couldn't take back. Richard stood beside me completely still. "Evelyn," he said quietly. I turned to him. There was no accusation in his face, no anger. Only confusion, and something like awe. I reached for his hand. "I was going to tell you," I said softly. "I know," he replied. And I believed him. Whitaker stepped slightly to the side, giving me space but remaining present like a silent anchor in the room. One of the guests, an older gentleman I recognized from town, leaned toward another and whispered not quite quietly enough, "Did he say, Admiral?" The answer came not in words, but in the way the room had already changed. People were sitting straighter now, listening differently. Even those who didn't fully understand military ranks knew enough to recognize the significance. Harold, however, understood exactly. He took a step toward me, then stopped halfway as if unsure whether he had the right to come any closer. "Evelyn," he said, his voice unsteady, I had no idea." I met his eyes. "I know," I said. That was the truth. He hadn't known, but he had assumed. And that had been the real problem all along. Diane rose slowly from her seat, her hand pressed lightly to her chest. "My goodness," she whispered. "All this time." Marianne looked between me and Whitaker, her expression somewhere between disbelief and realization. Kent for once had nothing to say at all. Harold tried again. "If I'd known—" I stopped him gently but firmly. "If you'd known I said, you would have treated me differently." He hesitated. "Yes," he admitted. "And that I said is exactly why I didn't tell you." The room absorbed that. Not just Harold. Everyone. Because what I had said wasn't complicated. But it was undeniable. Whitaker folded his hands behind his back, his posture relaxed but precise. "Admiral Carter," he said, turning slightly toward the room, served with distinction for over 3 decades. She commanded operations most people in this room will never hear about, and made decisions that affected thousands of lives. I felt a flicker of discomfort at that. I had never been one for public praise. "Tom," I said quietly. He inclined his head, just stating facts. Then he added more gently, "Facts that should have been recognized long before today." Harold flinched. I took a slow breath. This was the moment I realized not the salute, not the revelation, but what came after. This was where things could turn into something bitter. Or something better. I looked around the room. At the guests who had watched in silence. At Diane, who looked ashamed. At Marianne, who looked thoughtful. At Richard, who looked at me like he was seeing me for the first time and yet somehow more clearly than ever. And finally back at Harold. His shoulders had lowered. His certainty was gone. In its place was something I hadn't seen before. Humility. I didn't keep my past a secret to deceive anyone. I said, my voice calm but steady enough to carry. I kept it private because I wanted to live the rest of my life as a person, not as a rank. No one interrupted. I've spent years in rooms where titles mattered, where authority had to be clear, where decisions had consequences that couldn't be undone. I paused. But this, I gestured lightly around the room, this was supposed to be different. My gaze settled on Harold again. This was supposed to be about family. Harold's eyes dropped. "I was wrong," he said. The words came out quietly. Not polished. Not practiced. Just real. For a long moment no one spoke. Then Diane moved first. She stepped toward me, her eyes filled with something soft and regretful. "Evelyn," she said, "I'm so sorry. I should have said something." I reached out and touched her hand. "You're saying it now." That seemed to matter to her. Richard finally exhaled a breath he'd been holding far too long. "Well," he said with a faint disbelieving smile, "I guess I should have asked a few more questions." A light ripple of laughter moved through the room, not mocking, not sharp, but relieved. The tension cracked. Just a little. Whitaker stepped back slightly, his role in the moment complete. "I'll leave you to your celebration," he said. I nodded. "Thank you for coming." He gave me one last respectful look. "Always, Admiral." Then he turned and walked back through the room, the quiet authority he carried, leaving a different kind of silence behind him. As the doors closed, the weight in the room shifted again. Not gone, but changed. What had been humiliation was now something else. Reckoning. Understanding. And perhaps the beginning of something better. Harold remained where he stood, still processing. Then slowly, almost as if it cost him something, he took another step toward me. This time he didn't stop. And for the first time since I had met him, he looked at me not as someone to evaluate, but as someone he needed to understand. For a while after the doors closed behind Admiral Whitaker, no one seemed quite sure what to do next. The music had stopped at some point I hadn't even noticed when, and the trio in the corner sat quietly with their instruments resting in their laps, waiting for someone to signal that it was all right to begin again. Glasses remained half-raised. Conversations hung unfinished. Moments like that don't resolve all at once. They settle slowly like dust after something has been shaken loose. Richard was still standing beside me, his hand wrapped firmly around mine now, as if he needed to anchor himself to something steady. "You were a Navy admiral," he said quietly. I nodded, yes. He let out a soft breath, not quite a laugh. "That's not exactly small detail." "No," I agreed, "it isn't." He studied my face, searching not for answers, I realized, but for reassurance. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. There was no accusation in it, just hurt and curiosity. I turned slightly so we were facing each other fully, even though the room was still watching. "Because I wanted you to see me," I said, "not what I used to be." His brow furrowed. "I do see you." "I know," I said gently, "but I needed to know that first." That seemed to settle something in him. He nodded slowly. "You're right." And then, after a pause, he added, "I just wish I had known what you were carrying." That word stayed with me. Carrying. Because that's what a life like mine becomes eventually. Not a badge, not a title. A weight. Around us the room began to stir again. Not loudly, not abruptly, but carefully. A few guests resumed quiet conversations. Chairs shifted. Someone signaled to the musicians and soft piano notes began to fill the space again, gentle and unobtrusive. But the atmosphere had changed. People were looking at me differently now. Not just with curiosity. With respect. And in some cases with a kind of distance that hadn't been there before. That more than anything was what I had always tried to avoid. Diane approached again, this time more composed. "Evelyn," she said, "I can't imagine the responsibility you must have carried all those years." I smiled faintly. It wasn't something I carried alone. She nodded, though I wasn't sure she fully understood. Few people outside that world ever do. Marianne stepped forward next. "I feel like I owe you an apology too," she said. "For what?" "For not seeing what was happening. Or maybe seeing it and not saying anything." I considered that. Then I shook my head. "You're not responsible for someone else's behavior." She gave a small, thoughtful nod. "I still wish I had said something," she admitted. "That's fair," I said. And it was. Across the room I saw Harold still standing near his chair. He hadn't moved much since the moment everything changed. His glass sat untouched in his hand. He wasn't looking at me now. He was looking down. I had seen that posture before too. Not in men who had been defeated, but in men who had just realized they had been wrong. There's a difference. Defeat closes a man. Understanding opens him. After a few minutes, he finally walked toward us. Not with his usual confidence. Not with that careful, measured authority he carried like a second skin. Just slowly. When he reached us, he didn't speak right away. He set his glass down on the nearest table, cleared his throat, then looked at me directly. "I owe you an apology," he said. The room quieted again, not completely, but enough that those closest could hear. "I spoke out of turn," he continued, "and out of assumption." I held his gaze. "Yes," I said. He didn't flinch. "I judged you based on what I didn't know," he went on. "And instead of asking with respect, I pushed. I made it public when it should have remained private." There was no defensiveness in his voice now. No justification. Just acknowledgement. That matters more than most people realize. "I appreciate you saying that," I told him. He nodded once. Then, after a pause, he added, "If I had known who you were." I shook my head gently. "That's not the point." He stopped. And for the first time, I saw him really listening. "The problem isn't that you didn't know my rank," I said. "The problem is that you believed respect should depend on it." The words were quiet. But they carried. He absorbed that slowly. Then, almost reluctantly, he said, "You're right." That couldn't have been easy for him. Men like Harold build their lives on certainty. Admitting fault isn't just uncomfortable, it's disorienting. I spent my entire career in a system where rank mattered, I continued. It had to. People needed to know who was responsible, who made decisions, who answered for outcomes. He nodded slightly. "But outside of that system," I said, "rank is just a word. It doesn't define who a person is." I let that sit for a moment. "Character does." Harold looked down again. Then back up. And I misjudged yours, he said. Yes, I replied. There was no need to soften it. Truth doesn't require decoration. He exhaled slowly. I won't pretend I can undo what I said, he admitted, but I would like the chance to do better. That more than the apology itself told me something had shifted. Because doing better requires more than regret. It requires change. I studied him for a moment. Then I nodded. That's all anyone can ask. There was a small release in the room after that. Not dramatic, but real. Conversations resumed more naturally. The music picked up a little. Someone laughed at something across the room, and it didn't feel out of place anymore. Richard squeezed my hand. You handled that better than I would have, he said quietly. I smiled. That's why you married me. He chuckled softly, among other reasons. As the afternoon continued, people approached me one by one. Some offered congratulations. Some asked respectful questions about my service. Others simply shook my hand and said nothing at all. I answered what I chose to answer, and left the rest where it belonged, in the past. But through it all, one thing remained clear in my mind. Respect that arrives only after revelation is not the same as respect that exists from the beginning. And yet sometimes it's the only kind people are capable of at first. What matters is whether they learn to offer it without conditions. As I looked around the room at Richard, at Diane, at Marianne, and even at Harold, now speaking more quietly than I had ever seen him, I realized something I hadn't expected. This day hadn't just revealed who I was. It had revealed who they were. And more importantly, who they might still become. By the time the sun had begun to lower over the marina, the reception had softened into something quieter and more honest than it had been all afternoon. The shock had worn off. The whispers had thinned. People were no longer looking at me with that startled, searching expression they'd had after Admiral Whitaker's salute. They were looking at me more normally now, though, perhaps with a little more care than before. I was grateful for that. I had no desire to spend the rest of my wedding day as a spectacle. Richard and I had managed one slow dance, just one. The band was playing an old standard something from the 60s, warm and familiar, and we moved carefully across the floor with the kind of restraint that comes from years, not from lack of feeling. His hand rested lightly at my back. My head was near his shoulder. Neither of us spoke for the first minute or so. Finally, he said, I keep replaying the whole day in my mind. That's usually a sign of shock, I said. He gave a quiet laugh. That obvious? A little. We kept moving. Then he said more seriously, I'm not upset that you were an admiral. I certainly hope not. That brought another small laugh from him. I'm upset, he said, that you felt you had to carry that alone. I drew back just enough to see his face. It wasn't about carrying it alone. Then what was it about? I took a breath. It was about leaving it where it belonged. He studied me, listening. When you spend years in command, I said, people stop seeing the person and start seeing the structure around her. The rank, the authority, the expectations. Even after retirement, it follows you. People either stiffen around you or perform for you. I didn't want that with you. And you thought telling me would change that? I didn't know, I said honestly, but I knew I didn't want to begin our life together inside a title I had already spent a lifetime carrying. Richard was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded. I can understand that. I smiled a little. You don't have to understand all of it. I know, he said, but I'd like to understand more than I did this morning. That touched me. So I rested my head against his shoulder again and let the music carry us the rest of the way through the song. When it ended, he kissed my temple and said, whatever you tell me from here on out, tell me because you want to, not because anyone forced the moment. That was Richard all over. A decent man in an indecent moment, still trying to make room for grace. A little later, after coffee had been served and the cake had been cut, I stepped outside to the club's back terrace for air. The evening was cool and clear. The water beyond the railing had turned a deep blue-gray, and boat masts rocked gently in the slips below. From inside came the softened sound of conversation and silverware blurred now by glass and distance. I stood there for a minute by myself, one hand resting on the railing, letting the quiet settle my nerves. I thought I might find you out here. I turned. Harold stood in the open doorway. For once he did not look like a man entering a room he expected to control. He looked older than he had that morning, not frail, just stripped of some invisible armor. I didn't speak, I simply waited. He came a few steps closer, then stopped at what felt like a respectful distance. "I won't keep you long," he said. "That would be appreciated." He nodded, accepting that. For a moment he looked out at the water instead of at me. "I've spent most of my life believing I could read people quickly," he said. "It served me well in business." Or so I told myself. I folded my hands loosely in front of me, and today, he gave a humorless little smile, today I found out there's a difference between reading people and sorting them. That was better than I expected from him. He turned to me, then his expression plain, unguarded. "I was cruel to you." "Yes," I said. "I embarrassed my son." "Yes." "I embarrassed myself." I let that sit for a beat. Also yes. For the first time all day, something almost like humility passed between us without resistance. It didn't fix anything, but it cleared the air. He slipped one hand into his pocket and exhaled slowly. "I've been trying to understand why I reacted to you the way I did." "Have you?" "I think so." He looked down briefly, then back at me. "You made me feel irrelevant." That surprised me, not because it was impossible, but because he admitted it. I said nothing, and he went on. "Richard listens to you in a way he stopped listening to me years ago, not out of disrespect, just because he trusts you. And the less you explained yourself, the more I felt shut out. I told myself I was protecting him, but the truth is I didn't like not being the one with authority. There it was. Not class anxiety, not suspicion, not even disapproval at the core of it. Fear. The ordinary fear of a man aging out of the role he had built his identity around. I had seen versions of that fear before in officers facing retirement in politicians, after elections in men who mistake usefulness for control, and then don't know who they are without it. "It's a hard thing," I said quietly, "to realize the people you love no longer need your permission to build their lives." He nodded, harder than I expected. The honesty in that softened me more than the apology itself had. Harold looked toward the water again. "My father was the same sort of man," he said. Maybe harder. "In his house, respect meant obedience. You didn't question him. You didn't withhold information. You certainly didn't let him feel small. And now I asked..." He gave a tired smile. "Now I suppose I handed that legacy right down the line without thinking about it." I leaned back lightly against the railing. "That's how it usually happens." He looked at me, then genuinely curious. "Why didn't you destroy me in there?" It was such a blunt question that I almost smiled. "I'm sorry." "You could have," he said. "The moment Whitaker saluted you, you could have humiliated me in front of everyone, given a speech, told them exactly who I was, exactly what I'd done. I think they already saw." He winced because he knew it was true. "But that's not an answer," he said. "No," I replied, "it isn't." I looked past him for a moment through the window where I could see Richard inside speaking quietly with Diane. Then I looked back at Harold. "Revenge is satisfying for about 5 minutes," I said. "After that, you still have to live with yourself." He frowned slightly, listening. "I learned a long time ago that correction and humiliation are not the same thing. One teaches, the other only spreads damage." The wind shifted lightly across the terrace. Somewhere below us, halyards tapped softly against a mast. Harold's eyes lowered. "I don't know if I've done much teaching in my life." "Not today," I said. A corner of his mouth twitched despite himself. Fair enough. We stood there in silence for a moment. Then he said more quietly, "I was wrong about you, but worse than that, I was wrong in front of people I love. My wife, my daughter, my son." He swallowed. "I don't want that to be the last lesson they take from me." That mattered. Because by then I understood what this conversation really was. Not an attempt to erase his shame, not even a plea for forgiveness. It was the first time perhaps in years that Harold was speaking without performing. "You can't undo today," I said, "but you can decide what kind of man you'll be tomorrow." He nodded once firmly. Then after a pause he said, "I'd like the chance to earn your trust. Not because of your rank, because of what you showed me today." That was the closest thing to wisdom I had heard from him. I considered him carefully. Trust at my age is not handed out because someone asks politely, but neither is it withheld forever if change is real. "You can start," I said, "by speaking to Richard honestly, not as a father giving instruction, as a man admitting fault." "I can do that." And to Diane, I added, she's been smoothing over your sharp edges for years. His face shifted. A little shame, a little recognition. Yes, he said, you're right. I usually am. That actually drew a short laugh out of him. Not much, but enough to sound human. He straightened then, not stiffly, but with intention. For what it's worth, Evelyn, your restraint today said more about your character than any title ever could. I met his eyes. That, I said, is the first truly respectful thing you've said to me. He accepted that without protest. Then he gave me a small nod and stepped back toward the doorway. Before he went inside, he turned once more. I am glad my son married you. There was no polish in it. No strategy. Just truth. And because of that, I believed him. After he left, I remained on the terrace for another minute, listening to the water and the muffled warmth of the reception behind me. I thought about the strange shape the day had taken, how humiliation had turned into revelation, and revelation into something quieter and harder to earn. Not victory. Not exactly. Something better. Perspective. When I went back inside, Richard looked up immediately and crossed the room to me. You all right? He asked. I am now, I said. He glanced toward the hall where Harold had disappeared a moment earlier. Did he come out here? Yes. And I slipped my hand into his. And I think I said your father may finally be ready to grow up. Richard stared at me for half a second, then laughed, really laughed for the first time all day. And that, more than the salute, more than the shocked silence, more than Harold's apology, felt like the first clear sign that the worst of the day was behind us. By the time the evening began to wind down, the reception had transformed into something I hadn't expected when the day began. It was quieter, warmer, more honest. The kind of gathering where people leaned in closer when they spoke, where laughter came easier, and where whatever had been shaken loose earlier in the day had settled into something more grounded. The band played softer now. The sky outside had darkened into a deep navy, the kind that reflects faintly off the water like memory rather than light. Guests were beginning to say their goodbyes, lingering hugs, slow handshakes, promises to call to visit, to stay in touch. At our age, you learn that goodbyes are never casual. They carry weight. Richard and I stood near the entrance thanking people as they left. You gave us quite a story to remember, one of the older gentlemen said to me with a small smile. I wasn't aiming for that, I replied. He chuckled. The best stories never are. Another woman squeezed my hand gently. You handled yourself with such grace. Thank you, I said. But I knew grace had not been something I woke up with that morning. It had been built over years through discipline, restraint, and the understanding that not every battle deserves to be fought in the moment it appears. Sometimes the most powerful response is patience. Diane approached us once the last of the guests had drifted out. She looked tired but lighter than she had earlier. I don't think I've ever experienced a day quite like this, she said. I hope that's not a complaint, I replied gently. She smiled. No, I think it's a lesson. She turned to Richard, touching his arm briefly, then looked back at me. I've spent many years keeping peace in this family, she said. Sometimes that meant staying quiet when I shouldn't have. I listened. That changes today, she added. There was a quiet strength in her voice I hadn't heard before. And I believed her. A few minutes later, Harold joined us. Not at the head of the room. Not with an audience. Just beside us. He cleared his throat lightly. Most of the staff is beginning to clean up, he said. I've already spoken to the manager about the final arrangements. It was such an ordinary statement that for a moment I almost smiled. Because it wasn't about control. It was about contribution. A small shift, but a real one. Then he turned to Richard. I owe you something as well, he said. Richard looked at him carefully. You do? Harold nodded. I spoke today as if your judgment didn't matter, as if I still had the right to decide what was best for your life. Richard crossed his arms, not defensively but thoughtfully. I know you meant to protect me, he said. Yes, Harold replied, but protection isn't the same as respect. That was a good line. Not perfect, but honest. I should have trusted you, Harold continued, and I should have respected the woman you chose without requiring her to prove herself to me. Richard was quiet for a moment. Then he said that would have made today a lot easier. Harold gave a small rueful nod. Yes, it would have. The three of us stood there together in a kind of stillness that felt New. Not tense. Not fragile. Just unfamiliar. Like a room that had been rearranged after many years and was still settling into its new shape. Finally, Harold looked at me. "I won't pretend I can undo what I did," he said. "But I meant what I said earlier. I would like the chance to do better." I held his gaze. "You'll have that chance," I said. He nodded, accepting that it was not forgiveness, but it was not rejection either. And sometimes that's where real change begins. Later that night, after everything had been cleared and the staff had gone, Richard and I returned to my house by the water. It was quiet again. The kind of quiet I had always loved. He loosened his tie and sat down at the kitchen table, exhaling deeply. "Well," he said, "that wasn't the wedding I expected." "No," I agreed, "it wasn't." He looked at me, a small smile forming. "But I think it might have been the one we needed." I leaned against the counter, considering that. "Yes," I said, "I think you're right." He rested his arms on the table. So he said, "Are there any other surprises I should know about?" I smiled. "No more ranks," I said. "That's a relief," he replied. Then more gently, "But I'd still like to hear about your life, when you're ready." I walked over and sat across from him. "I am ready," I said. And for the first time since we met, I began to tell him. Not everything. Not all at once. But enough. About the years of service. About the decisions. About the people I had led and the ones I had lost. He listened without interruption. Without judgment. Without trying to place it into some category he could control. Just listening. And that more than anything told me I had made the right choice. As the night deepened and the conversation slowed, I stepped out onto my porch one last time. The water was dark and still now. The air carried that familiar coastal chill. I rested my hands on the railing and thought about everything that had happened. The insult. The silence. The salute. The apology. The shift. It would be easy to call it justice. Easy to frame it as a moment where truth prevailed and pride was humbled. But life is rarely that simple. What mattered more wasn't that Harold had been proven wrong. It was that he had been given the chance to see it and choose something better. Because in the end, titles fade. Positions end. Even the strongest reputations soften with time. But character is what remains when everything else is stripped away. I turned back toward the house where Richard waited inside. A new chapter. Not perfect, but real. And if there's anything worth carrying forward from a day like that, it's this. Treat people with respect before you know their story. Not after. Because by the time you discover who they are, it may already be too late to show them who you are. If this story meant something to you, if it reminded you of a moment in your own life where patience mattered more than pride, or where understanding came later than it should have, then take a moment to reflect on it. Share it with someone who might need that reminder. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, stories about life dignity and the quiet strength we carry, consider subscribing and staying with us. Because sometimes the most powerful lessons are the ones we don't see coming. Drag her out. The judge's voice cracked through the courtroom like a rifle shot. The gavel slammed. Every head turned toward me. The bailiff took a step forward. Across the room my father smiled. Not a nervous smile. Not an uncertain smile. A victorious one. The kind of smile a man wears when he believes he has finally won after spending 30 years trying. I sat perfectly still. The courtroom in Billings, Montana had gone quiet enough for me to hear the old ceiling fan turning above us. The bailiff reached for my arm. I looked past him and directly at the judge. "Does the name Raven 12 mean anything to you?" The color drained from his face. His mouth opened, then closed. For a moment nobody moved. Not the bailiff, not my father, not even the court reporter. The judge stared at me as if he'd seen a ghost. Oh my God. His voice was barely a whisper. "You are..." A sudden crash echoed through the room. My father had collapsed. My name is Sarah Whitaker. I was 58 years old that day, and for the first time in my life my father was afraid. But to understand how we got there, you have to understand the kind of man Frank Whitaker was. To the town of Red Creek, Montana, my father was a respected citizen. Successful rancher, church deacon, Little League sponsor, Veterans Day parade organizer. The kind of man people described as solid. The kind of man who shook hands firmly and remembered birthdays. The kind of man who could charm a room in 5 minutes. People loved him. I used to wish I could. Growing up, I spent years trying. Nothing worked. My younger brother Tommy was everything my father wanted. Athletic, outgoing, interested in ranching. Tommy could make one decent tackle during a football game, and Dad would talk about it for weeks. I got straight A's. Dad barely noticed. Tommy bought his first pickup. Dad framed the photo. I earned a scholarship. Dad asked if I was finally done showing off. Those things stay with a child, even when that child becomes an adult. Even when that adult spends decades pretending otherwise. My mother Evelyn was different. She saw everything. She never challenged Dad directly. Back then, most women in our community didn't. But she found quiet ways to let me know I mattered. A note in my lunchbox. A phone call after an exam. A hug when Dad wasn't looking. She was the bridge between us. When she died 6 years ago, the bridge disappeared. And whatever little relationship remained between my father and me disappeared with it. I hadn't spoken to him in nearly 5 years before the lawsuit arrived. At the time, I was living in Norfolk, Virginia. My life was simple. I owned a small house. I volunteered at the local veterans center. I spent mornings walking near the water and afternoons reading. After years working for the Navy, quiet felt like a gift. Then the certified letter arrived. I remember standing at my kitchen counter opening it. At first, I thought there had been a mistake. Then I read it again. And again. My father was suing me. Not just suing me. Trying to strip me of my ownership rights to the Whitaker Ranch. The ranch had been in our family for generations. When my mother died, I learned something that shocked everyone. She had left me a legal share. Not Tommy. Not Dad. Me. The decision had enraged my father. At the time, I didn't fight. I simply held the deed and moved on. For years, nothing happened. Then suddenly, 6 years later, Dad decided he wanted everything. His lawyers claimed I had abandoned the property. Claimed I had no interest in maintaining it. Claimed I didn't deserve ownership. The lawsuit wasn't about land. I knew that immediately. The acreage was just an excuse. Dad wanted one final victory. One final chance to prove I didn't belong. When I arrived back in Montana, the old town looked exactly the same. The diner still served cinnamon rolls the size of dinner plates. The church bell still rang every Sunday morning. The mountains still stood silently against the horizon. Only I had changed. Age does that. You stop trying to win battles that don't matter. Unfortunately, this one did. Because it wasn't really about me. It was about my mother. The share she left behind was her final statement. Her final act of love. A way of saying, you belong here too. I wasn't going to let my father erase that. The first day in court confirmed my suspicions. The judge and Dad greeted each other by first name. They laughed together before proceedings started. I watched from my seat. Dad didn't even try to hide it. He was comfortable, relaxed, certain. The entire hearing felt predetermined. Every objection from my attorney was dismissed. Every argument from Dad's side was accepted. Hour after hour. The outcome became obvious. Even the spectators seemed to know. By lunch recess, Dad looked happier than I'd seen him in decades. He actually winked at Tommy, like a man celebrating an early victory. That afternoon, things got worse. The judge ruled against nearly every motion we filed. Then he accused me of withholding information. Information that didn't exist. When my attorney protested, he threatened sanctions. I could see where it was heading. The final humiliation. Public removal from the courtroom. Exactly the kind of ending my father would enjoy. And then came the moment. The order. Drag her out. The bailiff stepped forward. My father smiled. I looked at the judge and asked a simple question. Does the name Raven 12 mean anything to you? Everything changed. The judge turned pale. The bailiff froze. My father's smile vanished. And as he collapsed onto the courtroom floor, one thought crossed my mind. For the first time in 30 years, Dad was finally about to learn who his daughter really was. The last thing my father saw before he hit the floor was the expression on the judge's face. I know because I saw it too. For 30 years, Frank Whitaker had believed he understood everything. Who mattered? Who didn't? Who was successful? Who was a disappointment? And most of all, who his daughter was. The moment I said the words Raven 12, that certainty shattered. The courtroom exploded into confusion. People stood up. Chairs scraped against the floor. Someone yelled for a medic. Tommy rushed toward our father. The bailiff abandoned me and moved to assist. But none of that was what caught my attention. I was watching Judge Harold Benson. His hands were trembling. Not slightly. Visibly. The same man who had spent all morning treating me like an inconvenience suddenly looked as though he'd seen something impossible. For several seconds, he simply stared at me. Then he leaned forward. "Clear the courtroom." Nobody moved. I said, "Clear the courtroom." This time everyone listened. The spectators filed out. The attorneys gathered their files. Even the court reporter looked confused. Within minutes, the room was nearly empty. My attorney, Susan Keller, turned toward me. "What the hell just happened?" I gave her a small smile. "Good question." The truth was, I wasn't entirely sure myself. I had expected recognition. I had not expected panic. Susan lowered her voice. "Sarah, who is Raven 12, I looked toward the window overlooking downtown Billings." "It's a long story." She waited. I didn't continue. Eventually, she sighed. "You're impossible." That's what my mother used to say. That earned a brief smile. Then the courtroom doors opened again. A paramedic stepped inside. "Mr. Whitaker's stable." Nobody responded. The paramedic looked around awkwardly before leaving. Judge Benson remained seated behind the bench. His eyes never left me. Finally, he spoke. "Miss Whitaker." "I prefer Ms. Whitaker." He nodded. "Ms. Whitaker." Silence filled the room. Then he asked the question everyone wanted answered. "How do you know that designation?" I almost laughed. Designation. Not name, not nickname. Designation. That single word told me everything. He knew exactly what Raven 12 was, or at least enough to be frightened by it. "I'm guessing you know," I replied. His jaw tightened. The judge looked toward my attorney. "Ms. Keller, court is adjourned until Monday." "Monday?" she asked. "That's 4 days away." "Monday." His tone left no room for discussion. The hearing ended. Just like that. No ruling. No decision. No explanation. After everything that had happened, we were simply sent home. Outside the courthouse, reporters had already begun gathering. Small-town reporters, mostly. People from local papers and radio stations. They surrounded Tommy the moment he emerged. My brother looked exhausted. "Is your father okay? Will the case continue?" "What happened in there?" Tommy ignored them. For once in his life, he genuinely looked lost. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. As Susan and I walked toward the parking lot, a voice called out behind me. "Ma'am." I turned. An older man stood near the courthouse entrance. Late 70s. Gray hair. Weathered face. Federal Marshal retirement pin on his jacket. Something about him felt familiar. He studied me carefully. Then his eyes widened. "I'll be damned." I recognized him a second later. "Marshal Grayson." He laughed softly. "Thought that was you." Susan looked between us. "You two know each other?" The old marshal shook his head. "Not exactly." Then he looked at me. "Been a long time." "Yes, sir." The respect in my voice was genuine. Years ago, our paths had crossed briefly during a federal operation. Nothing dramatic. Nothing worth discussing. But apparently he remembered. More importantly, Tommy heard everything. My brother had stopped halfway across the parking lot. He was staring. Confused. Concerned. For perhaps the first time in his life, he realized there might be entire chapters of my story he knew nothing about. I wished him luck. There were many. That evening, I drove back to the small motel where I was staying. The same motel I'd used during previous visits. The owner, Martha Jenkins, had known me since high school. She handed me my room key. "Heard about court." News traveled fast in Montana. I smiled. "I'm sure you did." She leaned across the counter. "Your father still stubborn?" I laughed. "Some things never change. Neither do daughters." Her words stayed with me. Upstairs, I sat beside the window overlooking the highway. The sunset painted the sky orange and gold. For a while, I simply watched traffic pass. It reminded me of evenings years ago aboard Navy installations. Long days, quiet nights. Time to think. People often assume military service is full of excitement. Most of it isn't. Most of it is paperwork, waiting, sacrifice, distance. The real cost comes later, when you realize entire decades passed while you were somewhere else. My father never understood that. As far as he was concerned, I had abandoned Montana. Abandoned family. Abandoned responsibility. He never asked what I had actually been doing. Never asked where I'd gone. Never asked why. Perhaps because he didn't really want the answer. The next morning proved something had changed. At 9 o'clock, my phone rang. "Susan, you need to hear this." I sat up straighter. "What happened?" "I just got off the phone with one of Frank's attorneys." That surprised me. "And apparently your father hired a private investigator last night." I wasn't shocked. That sounded exactly like him. "What did the investigator find?" Susan laughed. Not happily. Nervously. "Nothing." "What do you mean?" "I mean he quit." I frowned. "Quit?" "He refunded the money." Now that got my attention. Why? Susan hesitated. He wouldn't say. That afternoon, however, we got our answer. A friend of Susan's worked in town. By pure coincidence, she'd spoken with the investigator. The man had been visibly shaken. According to her, he'd spent 12 hours trying to research my background. Military records, government records, employment history, everything. Then he abruptly stopped. When Frank demanded an explanation, the investigator said only one thing. One sentence. Nothing more. Nothing less. I can't help you, Frank. Then he hung up. And from what I later learned, my father stared at that silent phone for a very long time. Because for the first time in his life, Frank Whitaker had encountered something he couldn't control. And it terrified him. By Friday morning, the story had spread across 3 counties. Not because anyone knew what Raven 12 meant. Nobody did. The story spread because people had seen Judge Harold Benson's reaction. In a small Montana town, that was enough. Judges weren't supposed to get rattled, especially not Benson. For 20 years, he'd built a reputation as the calmest man in the room. The fact that he had practically ended the hearing after hearing 2 words from me became the only thing anyone wanted to talk about. The local diner buzzed with theories. The feed store buzzed with theories. The barbershop buzzed with theories. Most of them were ridiculous. I was supposedly a former CIA operative, a witness in a federal mob case, a Pentagon official, a fugitive, an undercover marshal. One theory even suggested I had secretly worked at Area 51. That one made me laugh. The truth was both less exciting and more complicated. But nobody was getting the truth from me. Not yet. I spent Friday afternoon driving out to the ranch. Not because I wanted a confrontation. Quite the opposite. I wanted to see the place my mother loved. The gravel road hadn't changed. Neither had the cottonwood trees lining the entrance. As my truck rolled toward the property, memories surfaced one after another. Summer mornings feeding horses. Winter evenings around the fireplace, my mother humming while she baked pies. For a moment, I wasn't 58. I was 12, and Mom was still alive. The ranch house came into view. A familiar ache settled in my chest. Some places carry memories so deeply that time barely touches them. This was one of those places. I parked near the old red barn. The paint had faded. The roof needed work. Still, it felt like home, or at least the closest thing I had left. I walked toward the fence line where my mother used to sit in the evenings. She'd bring coffee. I'd bring a book. Sometimes we'd talk. Sometimes we wouldn't. Both seemed equally important. Standing there, I suddenly remembered the day she told me she'd changed her will. It had been 15 years earlier. We were sitting beneath the big cottonwood near the creek. I remember protesting immediately. "Mom, Dad's going to lose his mind." She laughed. "He usually does." "I'm serious." "So am I." I can still hear her voice. Soft. Steady. Certain. "Sarah, this isn't about money." "Then what's it about?" She looked toward the pasture. "It's about belonging." At the time, I didn't fully understand. Now I did. She knew exactly what she was doing. She knew there would come a day when she wasn't around to remind me I mattered. The land was her way of doing it anyway. Around sunset, I heard another vehicle approaching. I didn't need to look. I knew who it was. Tommy. My younger brother parked 20 yards away and climbed out. He looked older than I remembered. The years had not been especially kind to either of us. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. Then he broke the silence. "You could have called." I smiled faintly. "You could have answered." That ended the conversation before it began. Tommy shoved his hands into his pockets. "Dad's upset." I looked at him. "That's your opening argument." "It's the truth." "So is gravity." He sighed. The same sigh he'd been using since childhood whenever I became difficult. Or perhaps whenever I refused to surrender. "I don't understand why you're doing this." I laughed. That genuinely surprised me. "Doing what?" "Fighting." I stared at him. Then I stared a little longer, because I suddenly realized he meant it. He honestly didn't understand. "You think I'm fighting, aren't you?" "No, Tommy." I shook my head slowly. "Your father sued me." The words hit him harder than I expected. Not because they were new, because they were true. For years, Tommy had acted as though every family conflict somehow involved equal blame, as though fairness required splitting responsibility down the middle. Some situations don't work that way. Sometimes one person creates the problem. Sometimes another person simply refuses to disappear. He looked away. "Dad says you abandoned the family." There it was. The old accusation. The one I'd heard for decades. I took a slow breath. Then I asked a simple question. When Mom got sick, who paid for her experimental treatment? Tommy frowned. What? Answer the question. Dad did. No. His eyes narrowed. I continued. When the drought nearly cost the ranch 12 years ago, who covered the property taxes? Silence. Who paid for Uncle Robert's surgery? More silence. Tommy stared at me. A strange expression crossed his face. Confusion. I reached into my purse, pulled out a folded envelope, handed it to him. Inside were copies of bank records, checks, transfers, receipts, years' worth, quiet contributions, anonymous assistance, emergency payments, thousands and thousands of dollars, all linked to me. Tommy's face slowly changed. He turned pages, then more pages, then more. Finally, he looked up. You did all this? Yes. Why didn't you tell anyone? I almost laughed, because the answer seemed obvious. Mom knew. His throat tightened. That's it. That was enough. For several moments, neither of us spoke. The wind moved through the trees. Somewhere nearby, a horse snorted softly. Finally, Tommy sat down on the fence rail. He looked exhausted, like a man discovering he had misunderstood an entire story. I didn't know. I know. His voice dropped. Dad didn't know either. That earned a sad smile. Tommy. What? He never wanted to know. The difference mattered. A lot. Later that evening, after Tommy left, my phone rang. Susan. Her voice sounded unusually serious. We have a development. I leaned against the porch railing. What kind of development? A lawyer arrived from Washington this afternoon. I frowned. Washington State. No. She paused. Washington, D.C. Now I was interested. What does he want? Nobody knows. Who does he represent? Another pause. That's the strange part. What? Apparently he isn't representing anyone. I looked toward the darkening horizon. Then why is he here? Susan's answer sent a chill through me. According to the hotel clerk, he came to observe Monday's hearing. The line went silent. And for the first time since this entire ordeal began, I had a feeling Monday was going to be very different. Monday morning arrived cold and gray, the kind of Montana morning that makes people pull their jackets tighter and drive a little slower. I woke before sunrise. Not because I was nervous. Because old habits die hard. Years of military service had trained my body to wake before the alarm. I made coffee in the motel room and sat by the window. The parking lot below was empty. For a few minutes, everything felt peaceful. Then my phone rang. Susan. Ready? As I'll ever be. She laughed softly. That's not reassuring. I wasn't trying to reassure you. Fair enough. Before hanging up, she added something that caught my attention. The lawyer from Washington is here. Already. He arrived before 7. That was unusual. People don't fly across the country to attend small-town property disputes. Not unless something else is happening. I thanked her and ended the call. Then I stared out the window for a long time. Because deep down I knew exactly what was happening. The problem wasn't Raven 12. The problem was recognition. There are moments in life when a single word reaches the wrong ears. And suddenly people start remembering things they'd rather forget. The courthouse looked different that morning. Busier. Tenser. People gathered outside before the doors even opened. Reporters had doubled since Thursday. The local radio station was broadcasting from the sidewalk. Everyone wanted answers. Nobody had any. As I walked toward the entrance, conversations stopped. People stared. I wasn't famous. I wasn't important. But I had become the center of a mystery. And people love mysteries. Inside the courthouse, security seemed tighter than before. Even the deputies looked uncomfortable. One of them recognized me. His expression immediately changed. Not fear. Respect. The kind that comes from hearing rumors you don't fully understand. I nodded politely and continued inside. When I entered the courtroom, my father was already there. So was Tommy. Neither looked rested. Frank Whitaker looked 10 years older than he had 4 days earlier. His collapse hadn't been a heart attack. The doctors later called it a stress-induced episode. His body had simply reached its limit. For years, he had controlled every room he entered, every conversation, every relationship. Then suddenly he found himself facing something he couldn't understand. It was eating him alive. When our eyes met, he quickly looked away. That alone told me everything. My father had never looked away before. Not once. A few minutes later, Judge Benson entered. The entire room stood, then sat. The difference was immediate. Thursday's judge had been confident, relaxed, almost arrogant. Monday's judge looked like a man carrying a burden. He shuffled papers unnecessarily. adjusted his glasses repeatedly, avoided eye contact. The courtroom noticed. So did my father. And that worried him more than anything else, because Dad had spent his entire life reading people. He knew fear when he saw it. The hearing began. For several minutes, nobody mentioned Raven 12. Instead, we discussed property boundaries, inheritance law, tax records, routine legal matters. But everyone knew we were simply circling the real issue. Eventually, Judge Benson stopped speaking. He looked directly at me, then at my attorney, then back at me. Finally, he asked, "Ms. Whitaker," his voice sounded careful, very careful, "would you be willing to clarify your statement from Thursday?" The room became silent. I folded my hands. "What statement?" "You know which one." I did, but I wanted him to say it. The judge hesitated, then spoke quietly. "Raven 12. Across the room, my father visibly tensed. Tommy leaned forward. The reporters began scribbling notes. I took a slow breath, then answered honestly, "Probably not." The judge frowned. "Probably. Most of it isn't mine to discuss." That was true. And everyone could hear it, the difference between refusing and being unable. The judge understood immediately. So did the man from Washington. I noticed him for the first time sitting near the back row. Mid-60s. Expensive suit. Federal posture. Watching everything. Saying nothing. The hearing paused for recess shortly before noon. As people filtered into the hallway, something unexpected happened. Judge Benson approached me privately. Not as a judge, as a man. For several seconds, he simply stood there. Then he spoke. "I haven't heard that designation in almost 30 years. I studied him carefully. "Neither have I." His expression darkened. "I was a federal prosecutor back then." There it was. Finally. A piece of the puzzle. The judge continued. "There was an operation." I said nothing. He nodded. "Most records disappeared." "Yes. Most people involved disappeared too." "Also true." The judge swallowed hard. His voice lowered. "Some of us believed everyone connected to it was gone. Now I understood his reaction. Not fear. Shock. The same kind of shock you'd feel if someone walked into a room after being presumed dead for decades. The problem was that nobody had actually thought I was dead. What disappeared wasn't the people. It was the story. The records. The names. The memories. The entire operation had quietly faded into history. Exactly as intended. The judge looked exhausted. "Why bring it up now?" For the first time, I smiled sadly. "Because my father spent 30 years pretending I was nobody." Judge Benson glanced toward the courtroom, toward Frank Whitaker, then back at me. And suddenly he understood. This was never about classified programs, never about government secrets, never about national security. It was about a daughter. A daughter whose own father never cared enough to ask where she had been. When recess ended, everyone returned to their seats. The atmosphere had changed. The mystery remained, but the focus was shifting. People were beginning to realize the story wasn't Raven 12. The story was Frank Whitaker, and the daughter he never bothered to know. The hearing resumed. My attorney presented evidence. Financial records, property documents, historical ownership records. Then she introduced something new. A collection of payments, medical bills, emergency expenses, tax records, all linked to me, all connected to helping the family over the years. The courtroom grew quiet. Tommy looked stunned. Again, my father looked worse. Each document felt like another brick removed from the wall he'd built around himself. The wall that said I didn't care, that I had abandoned everyone, that I owed nothing, and received nothing. The truth was far less convenient. For years I had helped quietly, without credit, without acknowledgement, without expectation, because my mother would have wanted it that way. When Susan finished, silence filled the room. My father stared at the documents, then at me. For the first time in decades, he looked confused. Not angry, not defensive. Confused. Like a man discovering he had been reading the wrong map his entire life. Then suddenly his hand moved to his chest. Tommy noticed first. "Dad!" Frank didn't answer. His face had gone pale. The courtroom erupted into motion, and as doctors rushed toward him, I realized something important. My father wasn't collapsing because of Raven 12. He was collapsing because the truth finally weighed more than the lies. The second collapse happened in complete silence. One moment my father was sitting at the plaintiff's table. The next he was gripping his chest. His face had gone gray. Not pale. Gray. The kind of color that instantly makes everyone in the room understand something is wrong. "Dad," Tommy was already moving. The judge stood. The bailiff called for medical assistance. People rushed forward. For a few seconds, nobody cared about lawsuits, property rights, or courtroom procedure. They cared about a 79-year-old man struggling to breathe. I remained seated, not because I didn't care, because I couldn't move. I was watching the strongest man from my childhood suddenly look fragile, and no matter how complicated our history had become, that was difficult to see. Very difficult. The paramedics arrived within minutes. They stabilized him and transported him to St. Vincent Regional Hospital. The hearing ended immediately. No objections, no arguments, no complaints, just silence. The drive to the hospital felt longer than it actually was. Susan offered to come. I declined. This wasn't a legal matter anymore. It was family. And family has a way of becoming complicated when nobody is billing by the hour. By the time I arrived, Tommy was sitting alone in the waiting room. His elbows rested on his knees. His hands were clasped together. He looked exhausted. When he saw me, he didn't speak right away. Neither did I. Finally, he shook his head. I don't understand any of this. I sat beside him. I know. No, I mean it. He looked genuinely defeated. Everything I thought I knew keeps turning out wrong. I stared at the floor tiles. For once, I had no clever response, because I understood exactly how he felt. Sometimes the hardest thing in life isn't learning new information. It's realizing old information was never true. A doctor eventually appeared. Middle-aged, calm, professional. He'll be fine. Tommy exhaled so hard it almost sounded painful. The doctor continued. Stress played a major role. I almost laughed at that. If stress could be measured like rainfall, my father had spent decades standing in a hurricane. The doctor left. Tommy remained silent. Then he looked at me. Will you see him? The question surprised me. A week earlier, I would have answered no, without hesitation, without guilt. Now I wasn't sure. Eventually, I nodded. Yes. My father looked smaller in a hospital bed. It's strange how illness can do that. The same man who once seemed larger than life now appeared ordinary. Just another elderly patient attached to monitors. Just another man growing old. When I entered the room, he was awake. For several seconds, we simply stared at each other, neither knowing where to begin. Finally, he spoke. You're still here. His voice sounded weak. I pulled a chair closer. Apparently. A faint smile appeared, then disappeared. The room became quiet again. Outside, I could hear distant hospital activity. Nurses walking, phones ringing, life continuing. Eventually, my father cleared his throat. Tommy told me about the money. I said nothing. He showed me the records. Still nothing. My father looked toward the window. You paid for your mother's treatment. Yes. You helped the ranch. Yes. More than once. Yes. The answers came easily. The silence afterward didn't, because neither of us knew what to do with the truth. Finally, he asked the question that mattered. Why? I looked at him. Really looked at him. At the age lines. The gray hair. The exhaustion. And suddenly I saw something I'd never noticed before. Fear. Not fear of me. Fear of regret. I loved Mom. My answer was simple. It mattered to her. His eyes closed. For a moment I thought he might cry. Instead he nodded, slowly, as though absorbing something painful. Then he asked another question, the one everyone had wanted answered. Were you some kind of spy? Despite everything, I laughed. A real laugh. The first one in days. My father looked offended. What? I shook my head. That's what you're worried about. People keep talking. It's a small town. That isn't an answer. No. He waited. I waited. Eventually he sighed. So what were you? The room grew quiet. I could have told him about assignments, operations, classifications, years spent serving in places he never knew existed. I could have explained Raven 12, at least the parts I was allowed to explain. But suddenly none of it seemed important. Not anymore. So I gave him the only answer that mattered. I was your daughter. The words landed harder than any secret ever could. I watched them hit him. Watched understanding slowly replace confusion. For years, my father had focused on what I did, where I went, what title I held, what records existed, what records didn't. And in doing so, he missed something obvious. The person standing in front of him, his daughter. Nothing else should have mattered. Yet somehow everything else had. His eyes filled with tears. The sight stunned me. Frank Whitaker didn't cry. At least not when I was growing up. I never saw it happen. Not once. Now tears sat openly in his eyes, and he made no attempt to hide them. I failed you. The words were barely audible. I looked away. Not because I disagreed, because hearing them hurt more than I expected. The child inside me had waited decades for that apology. Now that it finally arrived, I wasn't sure what to do with it. My father continued. I kept thinking you'd come back and become who I wanted. I stared at the floor. When that didn't happen, his voice cracked. I got angry. Neither of us spoke. The monitors quietly beeped beside the bed. Finally, he whispered something that changed everything. I treated you like an enemy. The honesty caught me off guard, because it was true. Painfully true. For years, every success I'd achieved somehow offended him. Every accomplishment became evidence I was leaving. Every choice became a rejection. Not because I hated him, because I was becoming myself. The realization seemed to hit him all at once. His shoulders sagged, years of stubborn pride finally collapsing. Then came the question, the hardest one. Can you forgive me? The room felt very still. I thought about childhood, about my mother, about years of silence, about all the things we'd lost. Forgiveness isn't a light switch. It doesn't happen instantly. Not real forgiveness. Real forgiveness takes time, patience, honesty, sometimes more than one conversation. So I didn't lie. I didn't offer a dramatic speech. I didn't give him the ending he wanted. Instead, I reached over and adjusted the blanket that had slipped from his shoulder, the same way my mother used to. Then I stood. And before leaving the room, I quietly said, I came to the hospital, didn't I? For the first time all day, my father smiled. Not a victorious smile. Not a proud smile. Just a hopeful one. And somehow that felt like a beginning. 3 months later, I stood on the front porch of the Whitaker Ranch and watched the sun rise over the Montana hills. The morning air carried the scent of grass and distant rain. A herd of cattle moved slowly across the eastern pasture. Nothing seemed different. And yet everything was. The lawsuit was over. Not because somebody won. Because eventually nobody wanted to keep fighting. After my father's hospitalization, something shifted. Not immediately. People like Frank Whitaker don't change overnight. Neither do daughters who spent decades protecting themselves, but little things began happening. Conversations, questions, moments. The kinds of moments families usually have years earlier. We were having them at 79 and 58. Late was still better than never. The legal resolution surprised almost everyone. Including my attorneys, the evidence had become overwhelming. The ranch records were clear. My mother's will was clear. The financial records were clear. If the case continued, I would almost certainly win. Completely. My father knew it. His attorneys knew it. The judge knew it. So 1 week after leaving the hospital, my father called. The conversation lasted less than 10 minutes. But it changed everything. I want to settle. I stood in my Virginia kitchen holding the phone. What kind of settlement? A long silence followed. Then he answered. The honest kind. For once there were no conditions. No tricks. No hidden demands. No attempts to control the outcome. Just honesty. It felt strange. Almost unfamiliar. The final agreement gave me exactly what my mother intended. My legal share remained intact. No reduction. No compromise. No surrender. After 30 years, I had finally stopped letting my father decide my value. That alone felt like victory. But then came a second decision. One nobody expected. Including my father. Including Tommy. Including me. Because after the paperwork was completed, I spent several nights thinking about what came next. The easy option would have been selling. Many people advised it. Take the money. Walk away. Close the chapter. Move on. A younger version of me might have done exactly that. But age changes your perspective. You begin measuring success differently. At 25, I wanted justice. At 58, I wanted peace. They are not always the same thing. One afternoon, I drove to the ranch alone. I walked the property for nearly 3 hours. Past the creek. Past the cottonwoods. Past the fence where Mom and I used to sit. Every corner held memories. Some painful. Some beautiful. Most of them both. By sunset, I had made my decision. I wasn't selling. I wasn't seeking revenge. And I wasn't fighting anymore. Instead, I created something new. The Evelyn Whitaker Conservation Trust. Named after my mother. The woman who quietly held our family together long after she was gone. The trust protected the land from future development. Protected the wildlife habitat. Protected the ranch itself. Future generations could still work it. Still live on it. Still belong there. The way Mom always wanted. When I explained the idea to Tommy, he stared at me for nearly a full minute. Then he laughed. You realize most people would have burned the place down by now. I smiled. Good thing I'm not most people. He nodded. Mom would have liked this. That meant more than he realized. By autumn, life settled into something resembling normal, or perhaps a new version of normal. The kind older people eventually learn to appreciate. No grand dramatic reconciliation. No movie ending. Real life rarely works that way. Instead, there were small things. Phone calls. Coffee. Conversations. The occasional awkward silence. Those mattered more. One October afternoon, I returned to Montana again. The leaves had turned gold. The mountains stood sharp against a blue sky. As I approached the ranch house, I spotted my father sitting on the porch, alone. A blanket rested across his lap. For a moment, I simply watched him. The man looked smaller than I remembered. Not weaker. Just older. Age eventually humbles everyone. Even Frank Whitaker. Especially Frank Whitaker. I climbed the porch steps carrying 2 cups of coffee. He looked up. "You're late." I handed him a cup. "You sound healthier." "Doctor says I'm difficult." I laughed. "That diagnosis isn't new." A smile appeared. "The genuine kind." We sat quietly, watching the property, watching the afternoon drift by, neither rushing to fill the silence. For the first time in our lives, silence didn't feel hostile. It felt comfortable. Eventually, children appeared near the pasture. Tommy's grandchildren. My grandnieces and grandnephews, running, laughing, chasing each other through the grass. My father watched them carefully. Then he spoke. "You know what bothers me most?" I looked over. "What?" He took a long sip of coffee. I wasted a lot of years. The honesty didn't surprise me anymore. 3 months ago it would have. Not now. I nodded. "Yeah." Another silence followed. Then he added something unexpected. "I'm glad I got a few back." The words hung between us. Simple, unpolished. True. I looked toward the horizon. The same horizon my mother had loved. The same one she'd watched while imagining a future neither of us could see yet. Maybe she knew something we didn't. Maybe she understood that healing isn't dramatic. It's gradual, quiet. Built one conversation at a time, one choice at a time, one act of grace at a time. The sun began sinking behind the hills. Long shadows stretched across the fields. Beside me, my father sat quietly. Not healed completely. Neither was I. Some scars remain. That's part of being human. But we were finally facing the same direction. And for now, that was enough. If this story reminded you of someone in your own life, someone you've lost, forgiven, misunderstood, or perhaps still hope to reconnect with, take a moment and think of them today. And if you believe that understanding can arrive even after years of silence, feel free to share your thoughts below. Stories like these remind us that sometimes the most important conversations happen later than we planned, but they still matter. Thank you for listening, and if you'd like to hear more stories about family resilience and second chances, I'd be honored if you joined us again. I was already counting compressions when the general's voice cut through the room. "Corpsman, keep going. You're doing it right." For a second, no one moved. The music had stopped. Glasses hovered mid-air. My father stood 10 feet away, a crystal tumbler in his hand, staring at me like he'd never seen me before. I didn't look at him. I didn't look at anyone. I kept my hands locked shoulders over my wrists, pushing down hard and steady. 1, 2, 3. The woman beneath me, late 60s, maybe had gone pale. Her pearls were twisted against her neck. Someone had tried to loosen her collar but hadn't known what to do next. Most people don't. "Call 911 if you haven't already," I said, not breaking rhythm. A man in a gray suit nodded too quickly. "Already did. They're on their way." "Good, stay back, give her air." I tilted her head, checked for breath again. Nothing. No rise in the chest, no response. 30 compressions, I said quietly to myself. Then breaths. I'd said those words 100 times in training. Intense, in dust, in rooms that didn't look anything like this one, with its chandeliers and polished marble, and a string quartet that had gone silent in the corner. I counted again. 1, 2, 3. 20 minutes earlier, I'd been holding a tray. That's the part people remember when they tell the story now. Not the woman's name, Margaret, I learned later. Not the way the room smelled faintly of citrus and expensive whiskey. Not the way my hands ached afterward. They remember the tray. My father had placed it in my hands himself. Just help with the drinks, he'd said, like it was the most natural thing in the world. He hadn't raised his voice. He never did. He didn't have to. He'd looked me up and down first, my uniform pressed clean ribbons, aligned shoes polished until I could see the reflection of the ceiling lights. Then he'd smiled just a little the way he used to when I was a kid, and he thought I didn't understand something. Glorified medic, he'd added just loud enough for the couple beside him to hear. Let's not make a scene tonight. I remember the woman next to him giving a polite laugh, not unkind, just agreeing with the tone of the room. I didn't argue. I took the tray. And I smiled. The house sat on a hill outside Austin, the kind of place people slowed down to look at when they drove by. White stone-wide windows, a long driveway lined with trimmed oaks. My father had bought it 5 years ago after his company went public. He'd invited half the city that night, investors, politicians, a few military names I recognized from articles and briefings, including the general. I hadn't known he'd be there until I saw him across the room, tall, composed, speaking quietly with a small group near the bar, 4 stars on his shoulders, the kind of presence that shifts a room without trying. I'd kept my distance. Not because I was intimidated, because I was working. White wine, I'd asked a man near the piano. Thank you, he said, taking a glass. His eyes flicked to my uniform. You in the service? Yes, sir. He nodded, approving. Good, good. Then he turned back to his conversation. That was the night in a sentence. I moved from group to group, refilled glasses, stepped around conversations that had nothing to do with me. My father didn't introduce me. Not as his daughter. Not as anything. 30. I paused, tilted her head again, and gave 2 breaths. Her chest rose slightly this time. That was something. Come on, I murmured. Stay with me. When I went back to compressions, I noticed the general had moved closer. Not interfering, just watching his eyes steady, taking in each movement. You're centered, he said quietly, almost to himself. Good depth. I nodded once without looking up. Around us, people had formed a circle, but it wasn't tight anymore. They'd stepped back just like I'd asked. Space, air, room to work. My father hadn't moved. He was still holding that glass. I hadn't planned to come that night. That's the truth. My mother had called a week earlier, her voice softer than usual. He asked if you'd be there, she said. Did he? I'd replied. A pause. Well, I think he assumes you will be. That sounded more like him. I'd been back stateside for 3 months. Shore duty for the first time in years. The kind of assignment that lets you sleep in a real bed shop for groceries, pretend life is simple again. It doesn't take long to remember it isn't. Just for an hour, my mother added, it would mean a lot. To her, I knew. So I'd said yes. I'd pressed my uniform, checked my ribbons, polished my shoes. Old habits. Respect for the room even if the room didn't return it. Keep your elbows locked, the general said, now still calm. Let your body weight do the work. I've got it, sir, I answered just as steady. He nodded. No correction, just acknowledgement. That mattered. More than anything my father had said all night. EMS is 2 minutes out, someone called from across the room. Good, I said, we'll keep going. I finished another cycle, checked again. A flicker. It was small, barely there. But I felt it. Wait, I said, pressing fingers to her neck. I've got a pulse. The words moved through the room like a shift in weather. She's breathing, someone asked. Not yet, I said, but she's coming back. I adjusted her position, kept her airway open. Stay with me, Margaret, I said, though I hadn't known her name until someone whispered it beside me. Margaret, can you hear me? A shallow inhale. Then another. When the paramedics came in, they moved fast but controlled. One of them glanced at me, then at the general. Status. Pulse regained, I said. Assisted breathing, no obvious trauma. They nodded, taking over with practiced ease. Good work, one of them added quietly. I stepped back finally. My hands were steady, but I could feel the strain in my shoulders now, the dull ache setting in. The room began to breathe again. Conversations returned in low murmurs. The quartet didn't start up, but someone turned the music back on softer this time. I wiped my hands on a napkin someone handed me. And then, for the first time since it started, I looked up. At my father. He was still in the same place. But something had changed. The confidence he wore so easily earlier, the ease of someone who controlled every detail of the night, had slipped. Not completely. Just enough. He met my eyes. Opened his mouth. Closed it again. The general stepped toward me, then adjusting his jacket slightly. Corpsman, he said, not loudly, but clearly enough for those nearby to hear. You handled that exactly right. Thank you, sir, I replied. He held my gaze for a second longer. Then he nodded once. That was it. One sentence. One acknowledgement. But in that room, in that moment, it was more than enough. Behind him, I saw my father's hand tighten slightly around his glass. Not shaking. Just still. For the first time all evening, he didn't have anything to say. And I realized standing there in the middle of his perfect party that I didn't need him to. I left before the music picked back up. Not in a hurry. Not making a point of it. I simply set the empty tray down on a side table, thanked one of the staff for the napkin, and walked out through the same front door I'd come in. No one stopped me. Outside, the night air felt different, cooler than I expected, carrying the faint scent of cut grass and something distant like rain that hadn't quite decided whether to arrive. The driveway lights cast long shadows across the stone path. Cars lined both sides, polished and quiet, as if they were waiting for something to be resolved before they moved again. I stood there for a moment, letting my shoulders drop. Then I took a breath. My hands were still tingling slightly from the compressions. That always happened. It wasn't nerves, it was muscle memory unwinding, the body letting go after doing exactly what it was trained to do. A voice behind me said, "You did good in there." I turned. My mother stood just inside the doorway, her wrap pulled close around her shoulders. She looked smaller than I remembered. Or maybe I was seeing her more clearly now. "Thanks," I said. She stepped out onto the porch, closing the door quietly behind her. For a moment, we both looked back through the glass. Inside, people were moving again, conversations restarting in cautious tones. The kind of careful normal that follows something no one quite knows how to talk about. "Your father," she began. I shook my head gently. "It's okay." She studied my face, searching for something hurt, maybe. Or anger. "I didn't say anything," she said softly. "I know." That had always been the way between us. She didn't interfere. She smoothed things over. She hoped things would settle on their own. Sometimes they did. Most times they didn't. He was proud, she added after a moment, almost as if she were convincing herself. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I leaned lightly against the porch railing, looking out toward the long stretch of driveway that led down to the road. I remembered riding my bike there as a kid, trying to make it to the bottom without braking. My father standing at the top once watching, telling me to be careful but not coming down. He didn't look proud, I said finally. My mother's fingers tightened slightly on the edge of her wrap. "He doesn't always know how to show it," she said. I let that sit between us. It wasn't new information. It wasn't wrong either. But it wasn't enough. "I should get going," I said. She nodded, though it took her a second. "Will you call me?" "Yeah," I said, "I will." I meant it. I always did. The drive back into the city was quiet. I kept the windows down for the first few miles, letting the air move through the car. It helped clear my head. The road curved, gently, streetlights spaced far enough apart to leave pockets of darkness in between. I'd driven that route more times than I could count over the years. First as a passenger, then as a teenager eager to leave. Later only when I had to. Tonight felt different. Not lighter, just settled. I stopped at a red light near the edge of town and caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. The uniform still sat exactly as it should. No wrinkles, no signs of what had just happened. That was part of the job. You do the work. Then you move on. People assume decisions like mine happen all at once. That one day you wake up and say, "I'm going to join the military," and everything falls into place from there. It's not like that. At least it wasn't for me. I remember the first time I told my father I was thinking about it. We were sitting at the kitchen table in the old house before the company went public before the move. He had a stack of papers in front of him, numbers and projections, things that mattered to him in a way I didn't fully understand back then. "I'm considering enlisting," I said. He didn't look up right away. When he did, his expression was calm. Too calm. "In what capacity?" he asked. "Medical," I said. "Corpsman training." He leaned back slightly, folding his hands. Why, he asked. It wasn't curiosity. It was evaluation. "I want to do something that matters," I said. He held my gaze for a moment, then gave a small nod as if acknowledging a point in a discussion. "There are many ways to matter," he said. "Some of them don't involve putting yourself in unnecessary danger." "I've thought about it," I said. "I'm sure you have." That was his way of saying he didn't agree without raising his voice. What about school, he added. Business, law. You're capable of more than that. That in his language covered anything he didn't consider strategic. It's not less, I said quietly. It's just different. He didn't respond. Instead, he picked up his pen again and returned to his papers. Conversation over. I went anyway. Training wasn't what I expected. It was harder. Not just physically, though, that part was real enough, but in the way it stripped things down. You learn quickly what matters and what doesn't. There isn't much room for anything in between. The first time I had to perform CPR in training, my hands shook. Not from fear. From the weight of it. An instructor stood over me watching every movement. Lock your elbows, he said. Use your body weight. You don't hesitate, not ever. I nodded, adjusting my position. Again, he said. We practiced until the motion felt automatic, until the counting ran in the background of everything else. 1, 2, 3. It became part of me. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat, pulling me back to the present. A message. From an unknown number. I glanced at it at the next stoplight. This is General Harris. I wanted to commend your actions this evening. Outstanding work. I read it twice. Then a third time. Not because I didn't understand it. Because I did. And because it was simple. Direct. No extra words. I typed back. Thank you, sir. I was just doing my job. I hesitated for a second, then hit send. A moment later, 3 dots appeared. That's exactly the point. I let out a small breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Then I set the phone down and drove on. By the time I reached my apartment, the city had settled into its usual rhythm. A few lights still on in neighboring buildings. A couple walking a dog down the sidewalk. Ordinary things. I parked, turned off the engine, and sat there for a moment in the quiet. The night replayed itself in pieces. The tray. The words. The moment on the floor. The general's voice. My father's silence. I didn't feel victorious. That's the thing people don't always understand. There wasn't a sense of winning. Just a kind of clarity. I opened the car door and stepped out. Tomorrow things would go back to normal. Work, routine, the steady pace of days that don't make headlines. But something had shifted. Not in the world. In me. And maybe in time in him. People hear the word medic and picture a bag with a red cross on it. Bandages, maybe a stethoscope, someone who shows up after the hard part is over. That's not how it works. Not where I trained. Not where I served. The first lesson they teach you isn't about tools. It's about time. You don't have it, our instructor said on day 1, pacing in front of a line of us still trying to figure out how to stand at attention without locking our knees. You think you do, you don't. He stopped in front of me. When something goes wrong, you act. Not after you think about it. Not after you ask permission. You act. He tapped his watch. Seconds, he said. That's what you're working with. Training started before sunrise and didn't end when the sun went down. We learned how to move fast without rushing, how to see what mattered and ignore what didn't, how to keep your hands steady when everything else around you wasn't. They didn't ease us into it. They dropped us in. Simulations first. A mannequin on the floor, no pulse. Go, the instructor said. You move. Check airway, check breathing, start compressions. 1, 2, 3. At first it feels mechanical, like you're following a list. Then they start adding noise. Shouting, alarms, people talking over each other. You're losing him. Do something. Medic. Your job is to ignore all of it. Focus. Hands, pressure, rhythm. 1, 2, 3. They make it harder. Lights off, flashing strobes, someone grabbing your shoulder. Is he going to make it? You don't answer. You keep going. The first time it wasn't a simulation, I knew the difference before I even saw him. It's in the air. A kind of stillness that doesn't belong. We were stateside part of a joint training exercise, routine, controlled. Until it wasn't. A soldier went down during a drill, no dramatic fall, just stopped. By the time I reached him, someone was already calling for help. He's not breathing, they said. I dropped to my knees, hands in place. 1, 2, 3. There's a moment right at the beginning where your mind tries to catch up, to ask questions, to figure out what happened. You don't let it. You stay with what you know. Pressure, depth, count. 1, 2, 3. Someone knelt beside me ready with equipment. Another cleared space. No one panicked. That's the difference training makes. We worked together without talking much. Minutes passed. Or seconds. It's hard to tell. Then, a breath. Small, shallow. But there. Pulse, I said. The word felt solid in my mouth. We stabilized him, got him on a stretcher, sent him out. Later, someone told me he made it. I didn't celebrate. I just wrote the report. You learn over time that the job isn't about being the hero. It's about being the one who moves when no one else does. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes it isn't. You carry both. My father never asked about any of it. Not really. He'd ask where I was stationed, how long I'd be gone, when I'd be back. Logistics. Timelines. Things that fit into a calendar. Once after I'd been in for about a year, he asked, "Are you learning anything useful?" I remember that clearly. We were on the phone. I was sitting on a bench outside the barracks watching the sun come up over a row of low buildings that all looked the same. "Yes," I said. "Like what?" I thought about explaining. About telling him how to recognize when someone's airway is blocked, how to stop bleeding with whatever you have on hand, how to stay calm when everything around you isn't. Instead, I said how to help people. There was a pause. "I see," he said. He didn't ask anything else. Back at my apartment the next morning, I woke up early out of habit. The light through the blinds was soft, the kind that makes everything look a little slower than it is. I made coffee, sat at the small table by the window. My phone buzzed again. Another message from the general. "I'd like to put in a formal commendation, if that's all right with you." I stared at the screen for a moment. Formal commendations aren't something you chase. They're something that happen around you. "Yes, sir, thank you," I typed back. A few seconds later, "Well earned." I set the phone down, took a sip of coffee, looked out at the street below. People were starting their day, walking to cars, heading to work, doing the ordinary things that fill up most of life. That's what the job is for. Those ordinary moments, keeping them going. Around noon, I got another message, this one from my mother. "She's stable, the woman from last night. Her husband called the house. He wanted to thank you." I read it twice. Then I replied, "I'm glad she's okay." A moment later, "Your father is home." That was all she said. I didn't respond right away. I didn't know what there was to say. In training, they tell you something else too. It's not in the manuals. It's not written down anywhere official. But you hear it enough that it sticks. "People will underestimate you," one of my instructors said once, leaning against a wall after a long day. "Not because you can't do the job, because they don't understand it." He shrugged. "That's fine, understanding isn't required." He pushed off the wall, heading toward the door. "Doing it is..." I finished my coffee. Got dressed. Checked my gear out of habit, even though I wasn't deploying anywhere that day. Then I picked up my phone again. Scrolled to my father's name. Paused. Then locked the screen. Not yet. Some things don't need to be rushed. Some things are better left to settle on their own. By mid-afternoon, the apartment felt too quiet. That happens sometimes after a night like that. Not because anything is wrong, but because everything is still settling. Your body's caught up, but your mind hasn't quite finished sorting it out. I cleaned the kitchen, wiped down the counters that were already clean, checked my phone more than I needed to. Nothing new. Around 3, I stepped outside. The air had warmed up, a few clouds drifting slow across a bright Texas sky. Neighbors going about their day, someone mowing a lawn, a kid riding a bike in uneven circles, a woman walking her dog past the row of mailboxes. Ordinary. It grounded me. I walked a few blocks, hands in my pockets, letting the rhythm of it settle things further. Past a small diner I'd been meaning to try, past a hardware store with a faded sign. Places that had been there long before I arrived and would be there long after. Life moves on. It always does. The call came just as I was heading back. "Ma'am." "Yes." "This is Travis County EMS. We spoke briefly last night at the residence on Barton Creek Road." I leaned lightly against the side of a parked car. "Yes, I remember." We wanted to update you on the patient you assisted. Margaret. She's stable, he said. They've got her at St. David's, cardiac event. You bought her the time she needed. I closed my eyes for a second. Thank you, I said. No thank you, he replied. We see a lot of situations where people hesitate. That didn't happen last night. No, I said quietly, it didn't. We ended the call. I stood there a moment longer, then pushed off the car and headed home. That evening, I sat down with a legal pad and wrote out what I remembered. Not because anyone had asked me to. Because that's what you do. Time, position, initial condition, actions taken. I wrote in clear, steady lines. No pulse, no breathing. Initiated CPR. 30 compressions, 2 breaths. Continued until pulse regained. Simple. Accurate. Enough. When I finished, I set the pen down and looked at the page. There's a kind of peace in writing things down like that. It puts edges around an event. Keeps it from spreading into everything else. Around 7, my phone buzzed again. My mother. I let it ring once more than usual before answering. Hi, I said. Hi, she replied. Her voice sounded steadier than the night before. I hope I didn't catch you at a bad time. No, I said, I was just at home. A pause. I spoke to Margaret's husband, she said. He called again this afternoon. He was very grateful. I'm glad, I said. He said the doctors told him that if no one had started compressions when you did... She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. How's she doing, I asked. Stable. They're monitoring her. He thinks she'll be able to come home in a few days. That's good. Another pause. He also asked for your number, she added. I thought about that. Did you give it to him? No, she said. I told him I'd ask first. Thank you. If you're comfortable, I can pass it along. I nodded even though she couldn't see me. That's fine. I will, she said. We sat in silence for a moment. There was something else there. I could hear it. Your father, she began again. I exhaled softly. Yeah. He hasn't said much today, she said. He canceled his meetings. That got my attention. He never does that, I said. I know. What is he doing? Walking, she said. Around the house, outside, just walking. I pictured it. The long driveway, the back patio, the rooms that were too large for quiet. He asked about you, she added. I didn't respond right away. What did he ask, I said finally. He wanted to know where you learned to do that, she said. Last night. I let out a small breath. What did you tell him? The truth, she said, that you've been doing it for years. Did he say anything? No, she said. He just nodded. After we hung up, I sat for a while with that. Not the praise. Not the outcome. The question. Where did you learn to do that? It was the first time I could remember him asking anything about what I actually did. Not where. Not when. What? It was a small shift. But it was there. The next morning I reported in for my scheduled duty. The base was quiet in that familiar way, ordered, efficient, a place where everyone knew their role and did it without needing to be told twice. I checked in with the senior chief, reviewed the day's assignments, and moved through the routine that had become second nature. Vitals. Charts. Follow-ups. Nothing dramatic. That's most days. And that's a good thing. Around mid-morning, one of the younger sailors approached me. Hey, he said a little hesitant. You were at that event last night, right? The one off Barton Creek. I looked up from the chart I was reviewing. I was. I saw something about it this morning, he said. Someone posted a clip. Not the whole thing, just part of it. I felt a small tightening in my chest. What part, I asked. He pulled out his phone, tapped a few times, and turned the screen toward me. It was shaky footage. A circle of people, movement, voices. And then, me. On the floor. Counting. Hands steady. The general stepping into frame. No audio on his words. Just the moment. I watched for a few seconds, then handed the phone back. That's me, I said. Yeah, he said, it's something. It's just the job, I replied. He nodded, though I could tell he didn't fully understand. That was all right. He didn't need to. By the end of the day, the clip had spread. Not everywhere, but enough. Enough that people were talking about it in low voices in hallways. Enough that a few extra nods came my way. enough that the story had started to move beyond the room it happened in. I didn't chase it. I didn't avoid it. I let it pass through. That evening, as I was packing up to leave, my phone buzzed again. A text. From my father. I stared at the name for a long moment. Then I opened it. Can we talk? No extra words, no explanation. Just that. I read it once. Then again. Outside, the sun was starting to dip, casting long shadows across the base. I slipped the phone back into my pocket. Not answering right away. Not ignoring it either. Some conversations matter more when you take your time walking into them. I didn't answer my father that night. Not because I was avoiding him. Because I wanted the moment to settle into something real before we tried to talk over it. Too soon, and it would turn into what it had always been, him explaining me, listening, nothing changing. Some things need a little space to take shape. The next morning, I was already halfway through my shift when I got the message. Please report to command at 1100, dress uniform. No explanation. There rarely is. I checked the time, enough to finish what I was doing, clean up and change. Dress uniform always meant something formal, not routine, not day-to-day. I didn't ask questions. I finished my rounds, handed off my notes, and headed to the locker room. Standing in front of the mirror, I adjusted my jacket. Every line in place, ribbons aligned, shoes already polished. I'd worn this uniform the night of the party. But this felt different. Not because of how it looked. Because of what it carried with it now. I took a breath. Then I stepped out. Command was in a low building near the center of base. Clean lines, no excess. The kind of place where things happen quietly but matter. A petty officer met me at the entrance. "Ma'am," he said, nodding, "they're expecting you." I followed him down a hallway that smelled faintly of polish and paper. We stopped outside a conference room. He knocked once, then opened the door. "Corpsman on deck." I stepped inside. There were 5 people in the room. 2 I recognized from the medical unit. 1 from command. And at the far end of the table, the general. He stood when I entered. Not abruptly, not formally. Just stood. "Corpsman," he said with the same calm tone I'd heard the night before. "Sir," I replied, stepping forward. "Please," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. "Have a seat." I did. The others remained standing for a moment longer, then took their seats as well. A folder lay on the table in front of me. Closed. The general rested his hands lightly on the back of his chair. "I won't take much of your time," he said. "You've already given more than enough of it this week." There was a slight shift in the room, attention tightening, everyone aware this wasn't routine. I reviewed the reports, he continued. "From EMS, from the hospital, from your command." He paused. And I watched the footage. I kept my expression steady. "Yes, sir." "You acted immediately," he said. "You maintained proper technique under pressure. You gave that patient the time she needed." He wasn't praising. He was stating facts. That mattered more. "That's your training," he said. "Yes, sir." "And your judgment." I didn't answer that. He let the silence sit for a moment. Then he nodded slightly as if confirming something to himself. "Open the folder," he said. I reached forward and did. Inside was a single document. Formal, clean, precise. A commendation. I read the first line, then the second. My name. My unit. A summary of actions taken. Recognition of performance. I didn't rush through it. I took my time. When I finished, I closed the folder gently. "Sir," I said. "That's for you," he replied. "Official recognition. It will be entered into your record." "Thank you." He inclined his head slightly. Then, after a brief pause, he said something that wasn't written anywhere on that page. "Moments like that don't announce themselves," he said. "They don't give you time to prepare. You either step in or you don't." His gaze held mine. "You did." I nodded once. "Yes, sir." He took a breath, then shifted slightly, as if moving from formal to something else, still controlled but more personal. "I spoke with the patient's family this morning," he said. "She's awake, alert, asking questions." A small release in my chest. "That's good to hear, sir." "They asked about you," he added. "I told them what I'm telling you now." I waited. "That you did your job," he said. "Exactly the way it's meant to be done." There it was again. Not heroics, not exaggeration. Just the truth. The meeting ended shortly after. No ceremony, no applause. Just a few nods, a handshake, and the quiet understanding that something had been acknowledged. As I stood to leave, the general stepped slightly to the side, allowing the others to move past us. "Corpsman," he said. I stopped. "Yes, sir." He lowered his voice just enough that it stayed between us. "There will be people who misunderstand what you do," he said. "That doesn't change its value." I held his gaze. "No, sir." He studied me for a moment longer. Then he gave a single decisive nod. "That will be all." Outside, the sunlight felt sharper, clearer. I walked across the base at an easy pace, the folder tucked under my arm. No rush. No need to check my phone. Just walking. It buzzed anyway. I didn't look at it right away. I waited until I reached the shade of a tree near the edge of the lot. Then I pulled it out. "My father. I heard you're being recognized today." I read the message once. Then again. There was no question in it. Just information. I typed back. "Yes." The reply came quicker this time. "Can we meet?" I stared at the screen. The same words as the night before. But they felt different now. Less uncertain. More deliberate. I thought about the long driveway, the quiet rooms, the way he'd stood there glass in hand watching something he hadn't expected. I thought about the question my mother had told me he asked. "Where did you learn to do that?" I typed. "Tomorrow, coffee." A pause. Then, "All right." I slipped the phone back into my pocket and continued walking. No rush. No need to rehearse what I would say. This wasn't about proving anything anymore. That part had already happened. Quietly. On a marble floor. In front of a room that had gone still. For the first time since the party, I felt something settle fully into place. Not pride. Not relief. Something steadier. A sense that whatever came next wouldn't need to be forced. It would just unfold. We met at a place I'd passed 100 times and never gone in. A small coffee shop off a side street, the kind with a chalkboard menu and a bell that rang softly when you opened the door. Nothing polished, no valet, no long driveway. Neutral ground. I arrived early. Not to prepare, just to sit. I ordered black coffee, took a table near the window and watched the street. A couple walking past. A delivery truck idling at the curb. A man reading a newspaper 2 tables over, turning each page with care. Ordinary. It steadied me. My father walked in 10 minutes later. He paused just inside the door, adjusting slightly as his eyes moved across the room. He wasn't used to places like this. It showed not in discomfort exactly, but in the way he measured the space. Then he saw me. He nodded once. I stood. We didn't hug. We didn't shake hands. He sat across from me, placing his phone face down on the table. No glass, no audience, no room to control. "Thank you for coming," he said. His voice was even. Measured. "I said I would," I replied. A server approached. "What can I get you?" she asked. "Coffee," he said. "Black." She nodded and stepped away. Silence settled between us. Not heavy. Just present. "I spoke to the general," he said. I raised an eyebrow slightly. "You did?" "He called," my father replied, "this morning." I hadn't expected that. "What did he say?" I asked. "He said you handled yourself well," my father said, "that you were prepared." I almost smiled. "That sounds like him." My father nodded. Another pause. "I also spoke to the patient's husband," he added, "Margaret's husband." I leaned back slightly. "He was very grateful," my father continued. "He said..." He hesitated, searching for the exact words. "He said you gave him more time with his wife." I let that sit. It mattered. More than anything that had been said at the party. "I'm glad she's okay," I said. "So am I," he replied. The server returned with his coffee. He thanked her. Waited until she left. Then he looked at me. Not past me. Not through me. At me. "I was wrong," he said. No build-up. No explanation. Just that. I didn't respond right away. Because I wanted to hear what came after. He took a breath. I didn't understand what you do, he said. I thought I did. I didn't. I nodded once. That's fair, I said. It's not, he replied quietly. Not entirely. Another pause. I reduced it, he continued, simplified it, put it in terms I was comfortable with. Business terms, I said. Yes. He wrapped his hands around the coffee cup, not drinking it yet. I've spent my life measuring value in outcomes, I can see, he said. Numbers, growth, control. He glanced out the window briefly, then back. What you do doesn't fit that. No, I said, it doesn't. He exhaled slowly. When I saw you on that floor, he said, I realized something. I waited. I didn't know what to do, he said. There it was. Not about me. About him. The room didn't know what to do, I said. That's true, he replied, but I'm used to being the one who does. I nodded. I know. He held my gaze. And I wasn't, he said. No defensiveness. No excuse. Just fact. That happens, I said. He gave a small, almost humorless smile. I don't like it, he admitted. I didn't expect you to. We sat with that for a moment. Then he said something I hadn't heard from him in a long time. Where did you learn to do that? Not as a challenge. Not as a test. As a question. I answered it. Training, I said. Repetition. Situations where you don't get to hesitate. He listened. Didn't interrupt. First, you learn the steps, I continued. Then you learn to trust them. Then you learn to trust yourself. He nodded slowly. And the fear, he asked. It's there, I said. You just don't let it drive. He considered that. Then nodded again. I called you a glorified medic, he said after a moment. He didn't soften the words. He didn't pretend they hadn't been said. Yes, I replied. That was dismissive, he said. Yes, I said again. Another pause. I won't do that again, he said. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't an apology wrapped in emotion. It was a decision. I accepted it the same way. Okay, I said. We finished our coffee. Not in a rush. Not dragging it out. At one point he asked about my schedule, not to control it, just to understand. I told him. He nodded. We spoke about my mother, about the house, about small things that had been absent for a long time. Nothing forced. Nothing rehearsed. When we stood to leave, he hesitated for a fraction of a second. Then he did something simple. He placed a hand lightly on my shoulder. Not firm. Not performative. Just there. I'm glad you came, he said. So am I replied. He nodded. Then he walked out into the street, blending into the movement of people who had no idea who he was. For once, that didn't seem to bother him. I watched him go. Then I turned in the opposite direction and started walking. No rush. No wait. Just the steady rhythm of steps on pavement. That night my phone buzzed once more. A message from my mother. How did it go? I typed back. It was different. A moment later, different is good. I smiled slightly. Set the phone down. And let the quiet settle in. A week passed. Not the kind that stands out. No headlines, no interruptions. Just a series of ordinary days, work routine, the steady rhythm that carries most of life without asking for attention. That's where things change usually. Not in the moment everyone talks about. After. Margaret came home on a Thursday. I didn't go to see her right away. That wasn't my place. What I'd done belonged to that night, to that floor, to those few minutes that mattered. But her husband called again. His voice was steadier this time, tired but lighter. She's asking about you, he said. She doesn't remember much, just that someone was there. That's enough, I replied. He paused. You gave us more time, he said again. I didn't correct him. I didn't expand on it. You're welcome, I said. We left it there. Oh. The commendation was processed quietly. No ceremony. No speech. Just a document added to my record, a line that would sit among others, each one marking a moment that had already passed. That's how most of it works. You do the job. It gets noted. You move on. My father called on Sunday. Not a text. A call. I answered on the second ring. Hi, I said. Hi, he replied. There was a small shift in his voice, less edge, less distance. I spoke to Margaret's husband again, he said. They're doing well. That's good, I said. It is. A pause. I wanted to tell you that, he added. And to ask if you'd be willing to come by next weekend. I leaned back slightly in my chair. Is there something going on, I asked. No, he said, nothing formal. Another pause. Just dinner. Simple. No audience. No performance. I considered it. All right, I said, I can do that. Good, he replied. We didn't fill the silence with extra words. We didn't need to. I'll see you then, he said. See you then. Dinner was quiet. Not empty. Just measured. My mother had set the table the way she always did, careful, intentional, a small vase in the center, plates aligned. We sat. We ate. We talked about small things first. The weather. A neighbor who had moved. A repair that needed to be done on the back fence. Ordinary. It gave the space time to settle. Halfway through the meal, my father set his fork down. I've been thinking, he said. I looked up. So have I replied. A faint smile crossed his face. I imagine you have, he said. He folded his hands on the table. I spent a long time believing that if I couldn't measure something, it wasn't significant, he said. That if it didn't show up in a report or a balance sheet, it was secondary. I nodded. I know. He met my eyes. I don't believe that anymore, he said. It wasn't said loudly. It wasn't emphasized. But it landed. All right, I said. I'm still learning how to understand what you do, he continued, but I'm not dismissing it anymore. That's a good place to start, I said. He nodded. Yes, he agreed, I think it is. After dinner, we moved to the living room. No music. No guests. Just the three of us. At one point, my mother excused herself to clear the dishes, leaving us alone. My father looked at the bookshelf across the room, then back at me. I told someone this week that my daughter is in the Navy, he said. I waited. I didn't add anything to it, he said. I didn't qualify it. I didn't explain it away. I let a small breath out. That's enough, I said. He nodded once. Yes, he said, I think it is. When I left that night, the driveway looked the same as it always had. The lights. The trees. The long stretch leading down to the road. But it felt different. Not because the place had changed. Because something in it had. On the drive home, I thought about the moment on the floor. The count. The breath. The way the room had gone still. And the sentence that had followed. You're doing it right. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't meant to be. But it had shifted everything that needed shifting. Not just for me. For him. People talk about revenge like it's something loud. Something that announces itself. Something that leaves no doubt about who won. That's not how it felt. There was no victory. No triumph. Just alignment. A moment where what I did and who I was finally matched in a way that didn't need to be explained. If you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever had someone reduce what you do to something smaller than it is, you don't need to argue. You don't need to convince. You just need to be ready when it matters. Do the work. Hold the line. Let the moment speak for you. And when it does, let it be enough.